Good morning, everyone. I'm Bill Traynor. I'm the Dean of Georgetown Law. And on behalf of the law school, it's my privilege to welcome you to the Color of Surveillance, Government Monitoring of American Immigrants, which is our second Color of Surveillance conference in as many years. The Snowden disclosures of 2013 triggered a national debate about government surveillance, and that debate continues today. Yet, across that time and throughout that debate, too little attention has been paid to the fact that government surveillance does not affect everyone equally. There's a disparate impact to surveillance, color of surveillance. And this conference, which is hosted by the Law Center's Center on Privacy and Technology, is about closing that gap. It's about exploring the historical origins of that bias and about laying bare what it means today, when surveillance can be carried out at a previously unimaginable scale and with a previously unimaginable precision. So last year, the conference focused on surveillance of African Americans. This year, we'll focus on the surveillance of American immigrants. As Alvaro Bedoya, our center's executive director, argued in The Atlantic this morning, and if you haven't seen it yet, I urge you to go to the Atlantic and read his article. As he argued, the idea that immigrants are dangerous, that they need to be investigated and watched, that's a very old idea. But taking the modern machinery of surveillance and using it to that end raises novel and profound concerns for privacy, for civil rights, and for civil liberties. And we have a remarkable program today. It's extraordinary to see who our speakers are. And our speakers today, and it's truly an interdisciplinary program. They come from the fields of law and policy and history, sociology, technology, and the arts. They'll delve into all of these subjects. And I'm particularly proud that this conference reflects the law school's bedrock commitment to social justice. So if you go to the library, you see our mottos over the doors of the library: law is but the means, justice is the end. We have a bedrock commitment to social justice. And we're now focusing on applying that commitment to social justice to the field of law and technology and privacy. So in 2017, that intersection between technology and social justice is at the heart of what we do here. So before turning matters over to Alvaro, I want to close by recognizing the center's sponsors: the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Media Democracy Fund, and the Open Society Foundation. Without you, this center, this conference would not be possible. And then finally, I just want to thank Alvaro. Alvaro is, as I said, the executive director of our Center on Privacy and Technology. In a very short time here, he's really done two things. One, he's focused on making law students aware of technology and its implications for the law. And so he started new academic courses. We have a terrific program that he's involved in with MIT, where law students and MIT computer science students work together to study privacy and its implications and proposed regulations. So he's focused on making law students aware of technology and what it means for the law. And then he's put together some remarkable conferences that really grapple with the intersection of technology and law and think through what the appropriate limits should be. And I think in important ways, in conferences like this and pieces like his Atlantic article, he's doing so much to advance our national conversation. So without further ado, Alvaro Bedoya.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Dean Traynor. We could not do what we do without your support, without our faculty directors, and the support of all leadership here at Georgetown Law. Welcome to the Color of Surveillance. In particular, I would like to recognize two distinguished groups of special guests. Our speakers, who you will be hearing from shortly, and our Color of Surveillance delegation. Led by the Center for Media Justice. This is a group of grassroots civil liberties, racial justice, civil rights, privacy advocates from around the country. We are honestly lucky to have each and every one of you here. On Monday, December 7th, 2015, then presidential candidate Donald Trump called for a total and complete shutdown on Muslims entering the United States until, quote, our country's representatives can figure out what is going on. His words and actions have opened new wounds. But the fiction at their core, the idea that immigrants as a people are dangerous, that they must be closely watched and investigated, that we have to figure out what's going on, that is very, very old. In one way or another, our nation has been trying to figure out what's going on for more than a century. This conference will trace that history. We'll begin with the Chinese and Indian exclusions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Our interlocutor will be Center Deputy Director Laura Moy, whose own family was marked by the Chinese exclusion. Professor Mei Nai will explain that this year, 2017, is not the first year that our government banned a people and subjected them to extreme border interrogations. Professor Seema Sohi will explore how the transatlantic surveillance partnership that defines our modern era arguably has roots to the American, Canadian, and British surveillance of Indian immigrants on the Pacific coast of the United States in the early 20th century. Around that same time, the same government agencies spying on Indian immigrants were also spying on a nascent African-American civil rights movement. The movement of W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Nkechi Taifa will tell us about that surveillance, the persecution, and specifically the persecution and deportation of Marcus Garvey, himself a Jamaican immigrant. Most of you know that during World War II, the U.S. Census Bureau shared Japanese Americans' names and addresses with military authorities that placed them in so-called internment camps. You may not realize it, but you know this because of Professor Margot Anderson and her research partner, Professor William Seltzer, who discovered that sharing. And so today, Margot Anderson, joined by Center Faculty Director Professor Paul Ohm, will tell you about how she discovered the disclosure of Japanese Americans' data, how the Census Bureau initially denied it, in fact, for a long time denied it, and what those disclosures mean for the census, confidentiality, and statistics in government. After World War II, when Japanese Americans left internment camps, who moved in? Professor Ron Mize, will explain how, in many cases, it was Mexican-American guest workers, braceros. The surveillance of immigrants is not new. It is very old. But after 9/11, fueled by the war on terror and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the intensity of that surveillance and the technology used to effectuate it changed dramatically. Then came the candidacy and election of Donald Trump. When Trump calls Mexican Americans drug traffickers and rapists, when he says a judge cannot do his job because of his Mexican heritage, when he implies that Muslim immigrants are party to some vast Islamist conspiracy, we cannot pretend that it does not send a signal to the rank and file of our nation's immigration enforcement officers. George W. Bush and Barack Obama deported millions. Under President Obama, much of the technology of the war on terror began to be used to find undocumented immigrants. We did not get here overnight, but it has been decades since we have seen this marriage of open xenophobia and unchecked surveillance power. And so we will survey the current state of immigrant surveillance in America. We will look at the border. Hassan Shibli will discuss what extreme vetting looks like and how it is coupled with invasive high-tech device searches. Patricia Macias Rojas will explain how border surveillance is no longer just about border crossings. It's about surveilling border communities. And Patrick Eddington will talk about how border surveillance is no longer limited to the border. We will look at technology. At the heart of the technological transformation of immigration enforcement are biometrics, precise, digitized measurements of immigrants' bodies, their faces, their fingers, their DNA. Paramita Shah will discuss how ICE uses mobile fingerprint readers in the field, often without any kind of reasonable suspicion. Nima Singh Guliani will talk about how immigration authorities are using face recognition technology to search state driver's license photos for visa overstays. Ali Winston will discuss how this technology is used in ICE's gang databases. And the Senator's Harrison Rudolph, who has an article out this morning in Slate, will explain how the pervasive biometric tracking of immigrants is trickling down to all Americans. If we normalize scanning and tracking immigrants' bodies as if they threaten our society, it is only a matter of time before every body is scanned. How do we justify surveillance? One predicate is danger. Another is the idea that immigrants are different, that they are an other. Alex Naraste will explain how immigrants actually commit crimes at lower rates than the native-born. Shirali Munshi will explain how in the mid-20th century courts actually adjudicated whiteness. Joan Donovan will discuss how white supremacists use genetic tests to defend their whiteness. And we'll hear from Tenmori Soundararajan about how structures of power undergird structures of surveillance. We'll hear from Professor Arjun Sethi about how a campaign to win hearts and minds became a campaign to track those hearts and watch those minds. And we'll hear from Professor Xiaoxing Shi, who was wrongly accused of effectively being a Chinese spy. This conference will not just be about being watched. It will also be about watching back and mobilization. I'm honored that our keynote speaker will be Vanita Gupta, the new president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. As our nation's chief law enforcement officer for civil rights, Vanita oversaw the civil rights investigation and consent decree in Baltimore, which aims to change policing practices like stop and frisk that are built on the assumption that poor people, that people of color, can be stopped, searched, and watched at any time. We'll hear from Carl Lipscomb on how black immigrants are mobilizing to reverse patterns of racial and ethnic discrimination in immigration enforcement. We'll hear from Christina Sinha on how local communities are organizing successfully to curb federal overreach. We'll hear from Ken Montenegro on how digital security, digital strength, turns on the community as well as the individual. We will hear from Malkia Cyril on how communities of color, immigrants and native-born alike, are organizing to reverse the color of surveillance. And finally, we will hear from the Guggenheim Award-winning artist Hassan Elahi, who was wrongly investigated as a terrorist and who took it upon himself to surveil himself and meticulously watch everything that he himself did and send all of that information to the FBI. Before I turn it over to Laura Moy for our first panel, let me close with two notes. The first is about the nature of this conference. This conference does not center on debate. This conference is much more about exposition, about lifting up a history and an impact of surveillance that too often is hidden, undiscussed, and overlooked. But we do believe in intellectual diversity. That's why last year our conference featured the General Counsel of the FBI and senior officials from the Department of Justice. This year, we invited not one, not two, but 5 senior DHS officials, and each of them declined our invitation. Finally, I want to let you know that the conference won't just be occurring up here on the stage. On Twitter, under the hashtag #ColorOfSurveillance, right there, you will see a range of information, links to scholarship, art, history that supplements the conference, and I hope you join the conversation there. Without further ado, let me turn it over to my colleague, Laura Moy.
Thank you. Thanks for that great introduction. So good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome. Thanks for being here so early in the day to start the conference off with a sprint. So as we begin our first conversation of the day, I want to read you a brief excerpt from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision just last week on Trump's revised travel ban. The order makes no finding that nationality alone renders entry of this broad class of individuals a heightened security risk to the United States. The order does not tie these nationals in any way to terrorist organizations within the 6 designated countries. It does not provide any link between an individual's nationality and their propensity to commit terrorism or their inherent dangerousness. In short, the order does not provide a rationale explaining why permitting entry of nationals from the 6 designated countries under current protocols would be detrimental to the interests of the United States. So I'd like to think about that for a minute. But if we simply began the discussion there, at the present, we would be missing so much important history and context here, because the Trump administration's attempted travel ban, with its focus on banning nationals of 6 specific countries, that's in many ways an attempt to repeat history. So rather than starting abruptly now in 2017, we're going to begin today's examination of immigrant surveillance in the United States back in the 1800s. And just to add a little personal note, let me say that for me, this is a particularly meaningful point to begin this conversation, because some of my ancestors were arriving in the United States around the time that our conversation begins. Not the Irish and German ancestors who were still back in the old country, but the Chinese ancestors, the Mois. My great-grandfather, who was born in China, he settled in Chicago in the late 1870s. And as I've worked to document my family's history, I've read quite a few newspaper articles of the day, articles that referred to my great-grandfather's community as Celestials, Confucians, Mongolians, articles that lampooned their accents, that breathlessly detailed their heathen customs, and published the menus they enjoyed, the entire menus of the foods that they ate at banquet celebrations. Popular writing of the day alleged that the Chinese were impossibly different from Westerners, that the Chinese were cruel and antisocial, that the Chinese were incorrigible drug consumers, that they lived in squalid, crowded conditions and had no interest in attaining American living standards. And what happened? As Professor Mei Nai is going to discuss in just a moment, just a few years later, Congress actually passed a law that made it unlawful for people from China to immigrate to the United States. Thanks to that law, when my great-grandmother arrived from China, she had to meet and marry my great-grandfather in Vancouver before she could set foot on U.S. soil. Every time someone in the family wished to exit or enter the country, they had to subject themselves to a lengthy and intrusive investigation. Surveillance, disproportionate specific surveillance, became a part of life, and that law stood for some 60 years. And Indians were soon treated similarly. A few decades after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, Congress banned Indian immigrants, not by name, but by drawing a box around the region and calling it an Asiatic barred zone. Proponents of Indian exclusion argued that a great many Indians were anarchists and revolutionaries. And how did they address this? As Professor Seema Sohi is going to explain, they ramped up border policing, surveillance, and enforcement. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? And that's the focus of this first conversation. The things we're hearing today about efforts to exclude vast numbers of people from our shores, these are echoes of what we've been hearing throughout history in the United States. And to illustrate that past for us and its ties to the present day, it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce our speakers. First, Professor Mei Nai of Columbia University, a legal and political historian who's interested in questions of immigration, citizenship, and nationalism. And after Professor Nai, Professor Seema Sohi of the University of Colorado Boulder, who researches and writes about ethnic studies and whose book, Echoes of Mutiny, discusses race, surveillance, and Indian anti-colonialism in North America. So let's give them a warm welcome.
This is forward. Your full screen. Okay, thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much, Professor Moy, and I want to give special thanks to Georgetown Law, the Center on Privacy and Technology, Alvaro Bedoya, and Katie Evans and Harrison Rudolph, who've been so helpful in welcoming here today. So, okay, it works. There are many parallels between Chinese exclusion and the Muslim ban, or what I would call Muslim exclusion. I think travel ban is just a euphemism. Not least is the racial religious animus leading to group-based discrimination. But more than parallels and analogies, there is a direct connection in the legal foundations that justify these exclusions. That foundation is the rationale of national security and the extraordinary executive power attached to the power to exclude. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about Chinese exclusion, but what I want to do is draw you a genealogy from Chinese exclusion to Muslim exclusion. So I'm not going to go over this in detail because I'm sure you all know about it, but just to say that these words are from the second executive order, which modified the first executive order, mostly with some cosmetic changes. But it's made clear that national security is the purpose of the order, even if the actual national security purpose is demonstrably weak. And we have here the authority that the President used for this ban in Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that national security was not always the foundation of American immigration law. Before the Civil War, entry to the United States was not only wide open and practically unregulated, but there was also no federal regulation because Southern slaveholders did not want federal authority over the movement of their slave property. It was only after the Civil War that authority shifted to the federal government. In 1875, there were a number of cases involving state laws that imposed immigration taxes and bonds on arriving immigrants. They were all struck down on grounds that the regulation of commerce was federal responsibility. So the authority to regulate immigration was located in the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Immigrants were conceived as articles of commerce, highlighting the economic nature of migration and migrants as workers. Now, the Chinese exclusion cases shifted federal authority to a different jurisprudential location, that of national security. And I think it's worth reading this from the Supreme Court's case, Che Champing, which is also known as the Chinese exclusion case in 1889, which very clearly states that Chinese are a danger because they are an unassimilable race, and that as foreign agents of a foreign power, their exclusion may be warranted by the federal government. Now, the idea that Chinese are unassimilable is a fiction, and the assertion that they are foreign agents, or that immigrants in general are agents of foreign states, is likewise a fiction. And I find this particularly ironic because throughout most of the 19th century, Chinese emigration was unlawful. It was forbidden by the Qing dynasty, so they could hardly be considered agents of a foreign state if they were leaving unlawfully. And the United States, frankly, was settled by people carrying royal patents and charters. And one could say, you know, they themselves were agents of European empires. But in any case, this idea that immigrants are agents of foreign states is the basis for the so-called plenary power, plenary in this sense meaning absolute power, and the extraordinary, nearly unlimited power of the executive and a near total lack of rights that aliens have in matters of immigration. Now, this includes matters of admission, and here the logic of national security or national sovereignty naturalizes the idea that no person outside the nation has the presumptive right to enter. Right? And this is something that most people will say to you today, that nobody outside the United States has a right, a standing right to enter. Although, notwithstanding the fact that virtually all borders were open to the United States until World War I. But not only admission, but also in matters of removal, do immigrants have no rights? And this idea remains, I think, to many people today, much more problematic, insofar as it often means removing people who have become part of society, tearing them from families, property, community ties, etc. Now, it was just to justify the racism against Chinese that the Supreme Court would state in Fang Yuting, which was the first slide that I showed you, that, quote, aliens enter and remain in the United States only with the license, permission, and sufferance of Congress. So this was aimed initially at the so-called obnoxious Chinese, but it laid down a general policy that has endured to this day, applicable to all aliens, or more precisely to any aliens or group of aliens that the government wishes to exclude or remove. And this was important because in the 1880s, if the government was to just ban Chinese because they were Chinese, they would be subject to charges of discrimination under the 14th Amendment. Okay, so by placing immigration outside the Constitution as a matter of foreign relations, it put immigration in the same basket with Congress's conduct of foreign affairs. So, for example, immigration regulation is in the same category as the right, Congress's right to declare war on foreign nations, and its duty to make and ratify treaties. Most prominently, the plenary power and the national security argument have been invoked to authorize not only Chinese exclusion, but the exclusion of other Asian peoples. And this included registration, certificates of identity. For Chinese, they had to carry certificates of identity like an internal passport, which, if not produced on demand, could lead to deportation. And Asian exclusions were not repealed until the World War II era. National security also authorized the wartime internment of Japanese Americans, including American citizens, including registration and lengthened questionnaires to determine loyalty. And more recently, the national security argument was used to authorize the registration requirement of Muslim and Arab Americans under the NSEERS program. Oops, I don't want to go there yet. Extreme vetting is a new term coined by the president, but the substance of it has long accompanied our exclusion laws. Interrogation of immigrants with claims to enter legally, in the Chinese case, often as merchants or even as U.S. citizens. At Angel Island, which was erected in San Francisco Bay, Chinese and other Asians were detained for days, weeks, months, and some even for years while they were interrogated to try to disprove their claims of identity. Now, the executive order is interesting because it calls for uniform screening and vetting standards, which include in-person interviews and a database of identity documents to ensure that people are not committing fraud. But I think the in-person interview is a very interesting program or proposal because this is highly subjective, right? A lot will depend on what questions are asked and the attitude of the questioner. And we can see here that Trump's views and he said this when he signed the first executive order, and he talked about the interview process. He said, "We only want people to come to our country who love deeply America." And he was going to apply this to non-immigrant visa applicants, meaning tourists, businessmen, foreign students, right? That this is a high standard for non-immigrant visa applicants. And previously he had stated that categorically Muslims could not love deeply America because he says Islam is a hateful religion. Islam hates us. And he says it's very hard to define, right? It's hard to separate because you don't know who's who, right? So you see embedded in his language this very hateful this categorical discussion of Muslims. The Muslim bans also include the collection and dissemination of data on Muslim immigrants. And here you can see the kinds of surveillance and public surveillance that would take place. I've been told I have to stop, so I'm just going to very quickly show you these last slides on the consequences of exclusions and resistance and challenges that we have today, which are both taking place on the ground in the streets as well as in the courts. So thank you very much for your time.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks to Alvaro and the conference organizers for putting together such a remarkable program and for inviting me to be a part of it. So this past February marked the 100-year anniversary of the passage of the 1917 Immigration Act. And when this act was passed, it constituted the most sweeping immigration law in U.S. history. It had numerous restrictions, but there are two that I want to highlight today. The first has already been mentioned, the barred zone, the Asiatics barred zone, which excluded all peoples living within a geographic region that covered almost all of Asia. Now, because Chinese and Japanese laborers were already effectively excluded, the Barred Zone Act was intended to prohibit the entry of Indian migrants. The second provision of the 1917 Immigration Act that I want to focus on is one that increased the statute of limitations for deportation from 3 to 5 years for any immigrant deemed to have subversive or dangerous political beliefs or associations, namely those that could be construed as aligned with anarchism. Now, while it may seem as if these two critical provisions of the act, right, one that effectively excluded Indians and the other that cracked down on those deemed subversive, had little to do with one another, they were in fact deeply intertwined. By 1917, Indians in the United States were being racialized and criminalized as a Hindu menace. And this is a misnomer. The vast majority of Indians that came to the U.S. were Punjabi Sikh migrants, but they were referred to, right, as this kind of as a Hindu menace, which is a consolidation of racial images, and I would argue a distinctly anti-radical racial formation that linked aliens and radicals, right, in the public imaginary. So U.S. immigration officials and labor groups and congressional representatives had been pushing for Indian exclusion for over a decade prior to the passage of the 1917 Immigration Act. And public agitation against Indian migration sort of erupted in the late summer of 1907 when nearly 200 Indian workers were forcibly driven out of Bellingham, Washington, at the hands of an angry mob. In their exclusionary campaigns to exclude Indians, white workers across the Pacific coast linked their own struggles, right, as workers, to their white working class counterparts in Canada, South Africa, and Australia. And they saw themselves as part of a broader effort to protect and enforce what were commonly referred to as white men's countries by demanding the passage of exclusionary immigration laws. And so this kind of racial violence, this racial terror, right, is, was quite common in Asian American history and, against Chinese, against Japanese, and of course, against Indian migrants. In the aftermath of the Bellingham riots, Indians began explicitly linking racial violence and discrimination in North America to colonial subjugation in India. And so it was this kind of racial violence that really worked to mobilize a migrant labor force, many of whom were not political activists when they came to the US, 50% of whom were in fact veterans of the British Indian Army. And so their encounter with racial violence, right, in the US is what served to politicize them and mobilize them, and ultimately to organize an anti-colonial movement from which they attempted to overthrow the British Raj in India from the Pacific coast of the United States. So their anti-colonial politics quickly caught the attention of US officials, and this was particularly evident at some congressional hearings that were held in the spring of 1914, when the US House of Representatives Committee on Immigration and Naturalization met to discuss two bills aimed at imposing severe restrictions on the entry of what were called Hindu laborers. So the hearings were initially framed around a narrative that was quite familiar, I think, to people who study Asian exclusion, economic competition, labor threats, you know, an American standard of living. But as the hearings went on, calls for Indian exclusion became indistinguishable from the committee's anxieties over Indian anti-colonialism. Committee Chairman John Burnett of Alabama insisted, quote, that a great many of Hindus seeking entry to the United States are anarchists, teaching the principle of the overthrow of government, end quote. Representative John Raker of California insisted that Indians were making the country a hotbed of revolution. And by the end of the hearings, a number of representatives were insisting that Indians were dangerous and subversive agitators whose exclusion went hand in hand with the repression of various forms of radicalism deemed a threat to the nation's security. And so Indians were kind of alternatively referred to as anarchists, Bolshevists, seditionists. So by the time of the congressional hearings in 1914, right, congressional representatives were well aware of the Indian anti-colonial movement that had been forged from the Pacific coast. And when I say anti-colonial movement, I mean, this was a heterogeneous movement. There were many different players and leaders involved, but the most well-known was a group called the Ghadar Party. And Ghadar can be translated as revolution or mutiny. And this was a coalition of Punjabi Sikh migrant workers and Bengali and Punjabi intellectuals and students, and it was headquartered in San Francisco. And I apologize, the order is a bit off. So these were the headquarters initially when it was formed in 1913. This is on Valencia Street in the Mission District of San Francisco. And so all these different activists, right, they viewed their struggles against racism and exclusion in the United States as linked to the struggles of racialized and colonized people across the world fighting for racial equality and political independence. And for this, right, for this kind of anti-colonial politics, they were deemed threats to U.S. security and the British Empire and became the targets of U.S., British, and Canadian surveillance in North America. This is just an image of, so Ghadar's printing press was located in San Francisco, and they printed every week a periodical and a volume of poetry later by the workers themselves and circulated them. It was immediately banned in India. Every Indian migrant that returned to India from North America was searched, and surveillance reports that I've looked at in the National Archives indicate that British officials were looking for copies of Ghadar. And so this is Ghadar Di Gunj, which is translated as Echoes of Mutiny. So the British impetus, I think, here is quite clear, right? These revolutionaries were actively working to overthrow the British Raj. The U.S., the motivations of the U.S. might be less apparent, but the way in which it came to be articulated, right, the need for Indian exclusion was about, it was a domestic priority, right, that they represented a menace, okay, posed by foreign radicals who should not be emboldened to organize subversive political movements on U.S. soil. And they also represented a foreign anxiety, right, that was symptomatic of a larger threat of anti-colonial revolt across the globe. And I'm happy to talk perhaps in the Q&A about the kind of details of what this surveillance apparatus looked like, how it played out. But for now, I just want to say that British surveillance of Indian migrants in the United States was dependent upon their cooperation with U.S. immigration officials, right? And the exchange of information that immigration officials were giving to British authorities about every Indian migrant that was coming into the country that was deemed suspicious. And another thing that caused an incredible amount of anxiety was the potential dangers of Afro-Asian solidarity. And the most well-known example would be the friendship between Lajpat Rai, who was a very well-known anti-colonial activist, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And Rai was very influenced by Du Bois's work. And their mutual admiration of one another captured sort of the attention of U.S. intelligence officials who were monitoring both of them, right? And who, as one U.S. intelligence official warned, right, quote, "The present Hindu revolutionary movement has definite connections with the Negro agitation in America," end quote. So I'd like to just end by sort of returning to where I began, which is a reflection of, the 100 years that have passed since the passage of the 1917 Immigration Act, and thinking about the centrality of race, right, in the kinds of calls for exclusion and surveillance that the recent efforts that we're seeing in terms of the executive order are strikingly relevant, right, and connected to the same kind of rhetoric that we saw back in 1917, right, immigrant exclusion, surveillance in the name of national security. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. If I can just ask you both to make sure that you have unmuted your mics, your lapel mics, so that we can have our conversation. So I think I'm just going to ask each of our speakers one question, and then I want to make sure that there's some time for audience questions. So make sure you have your questions ready, and please do try to limit them to a question. So May, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how measurement of the body entered into to surveillance of Chinese who were suspected of violating immigration laws in the U.S. I know that you've written about this quite a bit, and it would be interesting to explore some of the parallels to measurement of the body in today's surveillance.
Sure. So Chinese entering or seeking admission to the United States included many who made claims to being citizens. And this was a way that they could circumvent the exclusion laws. And so there was actually quite a robust system of what they call paper son migration, where people had documents or they made claims that they had been born in the United States and then went back to China and then came back, or they had a son in China who then came and claimed derivative citizenship. So the obsession of the immigration authorities was to uncover fraud and to figure out who were really who they claimed to be and not claimed to be. So this was done by two measures. One was through interrogation, which was the photograph I showed you, which go on for weeks and months, but also through interrogation of the body. And so they would take measurements of the body using the Bertillon system, which was originally a French system. It emerges out of criminal anthropology to understand the criminal body, but there was a whole system of measurements. And then they would also do kind of ocular examination. So into a person's file would go all their measurements, as well as any visible signs like scars or moles or teeth, this kind of thing. So then that information would be in the file. So then somebody coming after that person, or if that person went back and then returned, they would have both the verbal interrogation as well as a record of the person's physical body.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And were there were also blood tests, I believe, done to try to determine paternity, right?
Right. That was mostly during the Cold War,
Mm-hmm.
and in Chinese exclusion, actually had been lifted, but there was still many people with claims to citizenship who were trying to come through Hong Kong into the United States. So they used blood tests to see if people were who they claimed to be in terms of their family relationship.
And Seema, I was wondering, you talked a little bit, you talked about certainly about British-U.S. anti-colonialism and some of the cooperation then between Britain and the U.S. I was wondering if you could expound a little bit on what cooperation between British and U.S. Intelligence agencies looked like and some of the parallels to surveillance cooperation among nations today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. So, the British surveillance apparatus, I think, sort of really began to develop in India in 1906, right? And so a lot of Indian activists and intellectuals left India, went to Paris, went to Tokyo to try to organize from there, and then were kind of followed, right? And so then they came to the US. I don't know how much they believed this, but what they said in their writings was, well, this will be a safe haven for us because this is the same place, you've sort of fought against the same empire that we fought against. So British surveillance, of course, then followed them, right, to the Pacific coast and forged kind of really strong alliances with the Bureau of Immigration, which went all the way up to the Commissioner General of Immigration's office in Washington, D.C., right? And so you have the most well-known figure is a man by the name of William Hopkinson, who was hired in Canada, right, by the Immigration Department, sort of sent by the British to monitor Indian migrants, and who was, quite close, had a very close working relationship with the immigration officials in San Francisco, right? And so they would exchange information with one another. He would write to the Commissioner General of Immigration saying, Har Dayal was a very sort of, he was a radical. He actually was an anarchist. He's speaking at these various places this summer. You need to send immigration officials there to record what he's talking about, right? And then they would attempt to build deportation cases against the most prominent leaders using the 1903 anti-anarchy law, which would allow them to deport anyone deemed an anarchist. And then you also had the U.S. consulates across Asia, consul generals working very closely with, sending information to the State Department back in the U.S. about Indians leaving India that they thought should be monitored. And then the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., sort of, in close cooperation, working very closely with the State Department. And we were talking about, they would give the names of specific people, right, who are coming in. These people need to be monitored. So those are some
obvious parallels.
Yeah.
So I'd like to invite a couple questions from the audience. I think since we have just about 5 minutes left, I think I'm going to invite 2 questions from the audience, and we'll hear both questions, and then maybe make an attempt to answer both of them. So questions? Right here in the front.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis. I study international education policy at the American University here in DC. And my question is concerning perception. A lot of the major universities in the district and around the country have been having a very difficult time getting their international students who come from countries like India and South Korea and China and Japan to interact with American students once they get to campus. And they're finding out that just simply putting them in the same room during orientation isn't enough. They kind of have to have different tactics to get people to interact with one another because of the perception of, what you may think of me or what have you such. So what can we do to kind of break down that barrier psychologically so at the collegiate level we can get a more productive conversation on a myriad of intellectual spheres? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let's invite one more question from the audience to tee up before we turn to our speakers. Yes, over there. Sorry, I see you in the blue dress on the far right first. And Julian reminded me that I ought to remind our speakers, please introduce yourself if you're comfortable doing so.
Sure. Good morning. My name's Shalini Edens. I'm with Urgent Action Fund. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm curious if you can highlight the historical story that you told was fascinating and also compelling. And you talked a lot about the race aspects and the connections across regions. Can you talk a little bit about the gender and where are we seeing gender show up historically in surveillance? Thank you.
Great. So those are two questions that you guys should be able to answer in 2 minutes each, right? All right, let's take a stab at it.
Okay.
All right, well, on the first question, at my university, we have the same phenomenon, and I think what I observe is that when the students who are organized, the organized students groups, when those organizations reach out to each other, it's a way to begin a process, right? Because they have already a certain consciousness and an interest in building ties with other students, right? And at my university, that seems to mostly be among students of color. So students who are from Asia and Asian Americans working with Latino students and African American students and African students. So that's, I think, one path where I've seen it start. But that's a long process because there are a lot of, there's both prejudices and I think there's also comfort zones that students find when they're with people like them, right? So that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? On the other question about gender, you know, for Asian migrations in the 19th century and the early 20th century, they were mostly labor migrations. They were mostly men who came. And this created a lot of gender issues, not least which was a disproportionate sex ratio in the immigrant populations, but also some of the racial stereotypes of laboring men were very gendered. So Chinese in many ways were feminized. Well, sometimes they were seen as sexual predators, but mostly they were feminized as being kind of less than manly. And that was also reinforced by Chinese men in the West taking up occupations that were domestic, right? Like washing clothes and cooking food, right? These were jobs that nobody else wanted in the early days of the West. And so they were seen as doing feminine occupations. Chinese women who came to the United States were presumptively considered to be prostitutes. And so they had to prove that they weren't prostitutes, which is, as you know, always hard to prove a negative.
And Seema, if you have thoughts.
Sure, yeah. So I'll take the gender question first. And
This is gonna be the last word too, I think.
Okay.
Right.
No pressure. The same thing. The vast majority were men, but the gender discourse is really fascinating, particularly because so many of these men were Punjabi Sikhs who had a long history of being actively recruited for the British Indian Army in a really problematic British sort of gendering of them as the most martial of Indians, and so a lot of their anti-colonial rhetoric was about recuperating a colonial manhood that they'd been stripped of sort of as colonized subjects. At the same time, a lot of the intellectual men, they were deemed a threat to white womanhood, and so there was definitely a discourse of a fear, right, of them sort of marrying white women, right, and that their exclusion was also deemed, once again, right, protecting white womanhood. And so there very much was a gendered kind of language and rationale operating. In terms of your question, I think I agree with May, which is, this importance of student activist groups, but we can talk about this perhaps more later.
One more thing? Yes, just one more thing. So throughout the West, in most of the Western states, there were anti-miscegenation laws that were applied to Asians.
Right.
So even though Asian men came on their own, many of them who wanted to settle down in this country, they couldn't bring a wife because of the exclusion laws, but they also were not allowed to marry whites. So among Sikhs in California, you actually had a practice of marrying with Mexican women, and Chinese men sometimes married they married Mexicans or in some cases African American women.
All right, thank you very much to our speakers and thanks for the great questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Nye, Professor Sohi, and Laura, Professor Moy. We've been discussing this morning that a predicate to surveillance is danger, and in the case of our conference, the idea that immigrants are dangerous. The poet Solmaz Sharif provides, I think, an apt metaphor for this in her poem Persian Letters, and that's the metaphor of David and Goliath. She writes, quote, "David, they tell me, is the one should aspire to. But ever since I first heard them say Philistine, I've known I am Goliath, if I am anything." So are immigrants Goliath? Are they dangerous? Are they threatening? Are they threats? With us to discuss this, please welcome Alex Naraste from the Cato Institute on the myth and reality of immigrant criminality.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. I think it's no secret, seen from about the time of June 2015 when President or then candidate Trump entered the election, that immigrant criminality or terrorism was going to be sort of a focus point or one of the main driving points for some of the opinion, especially amongst immigration restrictionists. So what I decided to do was take a look in a couple of studies that I have here, terrorism and immigration, as well as criminal immigrants, where I try to estimate the unlawful immigrant incarceration rates, try to get at what these numbers are. Now, just a few quick introductions before I present these. There's a lot of public perceptions about what risk is, or what danger is, or what safety is. There's no such thing as perfect safety. There's no such thing as perfect danger. It's on a continuum. It's not binary. Everything is risky, even in action. Even not taking any actions can be risky. So I think our task is, and this probably shows my biases as an economist, but I think our task is to analyze risk in terms of the costs and benefits of each action to decide how much risk is worth taking. So I'd attempt to apply these normal risk analysis numbers to foreign-born terrorism and crime inside the United States committed by foreign-born people. So in order to calculate the terrorism, the risk of dying in a terrorist attack committed by a foreigner on U.S. soil, I just want to run through this very quickly so you know I'm not pulling the wool over your eyes. I basically need to know the number of foreign-born terrorists attacking or planning to attack an attack on U.S. soil. And I didn't include people who are trying to send money abroad, $500 to al-Shabaab militia or something like that, because the administration, the previous administration, everybody's worried about attacks on U.S. soil. They're not necessarily as worried about somebody sending some money overseas. So the damage done to Americans domestically is what I took a look at. For each of them, I took a look at the murders and the damage that they caused in an attack, if they did, the visas they were initially issued in order to enter the U.S., and then the total number of visas issued in all those categories per year. And my broad conclusion is that tourists and other non-immigrants are the most likely to commit deadly terrorist attacks in the United States, not those who come here to settle permanently. So my headline results, taking a look at the years 1975 through the end of 2015, I found 154 foreign-born terrorists in terrorism databases and other sources. They killed a total of 3,024 Americans on U.S. soil. 98.6% of those are on 9/11, so that's 2,983 of those victims occurred on 9/11. During this time, a total of 3,432 Americans were murdered on U.S. soil by all terrorists, including those who are Americans, native-born terrorists. So there is a grain of truth in what a lot of restrictionists say, which is that 88% of all the deaths by terrorism on U.S. soil were caused by foreigners during that time period. But as I'll show in a second, the risk is still very small. So your annual chance of dying in foreign-born terrorism committed by somebody in each of these categories, an unlawful or illegal immigrant, your annual chance, I found one unlawful immigrant who entered unlawfully, who participated in a terrorist attack that killed one person. That means that during this time period, your annual chance of being killed by an unlawful immigrant in a terrorist attack is 1 in 10.9 billion per year. I don't need to tell you how laughable that is. You can laugh. Lawful permanent residents killed 10 people in terrorist attacks, so it's about 1 in 1 billion per year. unknown. I couldn't find visas categories for them. During this time period, there were 3 refugees who participated in three victims of terrorist attacks committed by refugees during this time period, all in the late 1970s, 1 in 3.64 billion per year. Asylum seekers, 1 in 2.7. K-1 visas, which is a fiancé visa that was issued to Tashfeen Malik, who was one of the shooters in the San Bernardino attack in late 2015, 1 in 780 million per year. And then we get down to the interesting ones. So one of the 9/11 hijackers was entered on a student visa. So that's why, and I divided up the casualties or the deaths on 9/11 equally amongst all the hijackers. So that means your annual chance of being killed is 1 in 69 million a year. And then now we get down to tourists on a B visa. Because 18 of the 19 9/11 hijackers entered on tourist visas of one kind, that makes them seem the most dangerous at 1 in 3.86 billion per year. Now altogether, when you combine these, the entire chance during that time period of being killed in any year by a foreign-born terrorist is 1 in 3.6 million per year, which is about 255 times as great, 255th likely. Basically, your likelihood of being murdered is 255 times as great in each year in a normal homicide. Now, then we have to compare that to the number of entries on each of these visas per year to try to figure out what the actual risk is. So visa waiver program, 3 terrorists entered, they killed 0 people during that time period, but there are 388 million entries on the visa waiver program. So there are about 129 million entries per terrorist on that program. I think that sounds pretty good. That's not that dangerous. And then we can go down the list. There were 3.3 million refugees admitted during this time period. 20 of them were convicted or committed a terrorist attack on U.S. soil. They killed 3 people. So that's 1 terrorist for every 162,000 let in. And you can see that all the way up and down this line on the right, which is the number of visas issued per terrorist allowed into the United States. So these are pretty small risks. Now, moving to the other side of this coin, other side of this ledger, is taking a look at crime rates. Now, there's a lot of academic literature out there about the danger or the likelihood of a foreign-born person being incarcerated in the United States for crime. But the criticism we always get is that that includes legal and unlawful immigrants. You know, it's hard to separate that in the census data. So when I say foreigners are incarcerated at a lower rate overall than native-born Americans, people will say, oh yeah, but you can't separate out legal from illegal immigrants. It might be that legal immigrants are really peaceful, but illegal immigrants are really dangerous, and you can't separate this out, Alex, so how can you possibly say that they're all right? So we use the residual statistical technique that Pew uses to take a look at the characteristics of suspected unlawful immigrants in the census to try to narrow down who they are in the incarcerated population, to try to get an estimate of who they are. So it's used not just by Pew, but also by anti-immigration groups like the Center for Immigration Studies. So they both agree on the methods. So we just applied them to a different subset of the census to see what the incarceration rates are. So we took a look at incarceration rates age 18 to 54 in the United States. This is state, federal, all prisons in the United States, including immigration detention. And we found that the incarceration rate for natives is in that age group is 1.53%. So that's pretty high. I think, as you know, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. We have a bad combination of a lot of terrible laws and a lot of resources to waste. So we have a very high incarceration rate. When I narrowed down to unlawful immigrants, to this subset of the population that we took a look at, we found the incarceration was a mere 0.85% of that population in the same age range. So it drops, it's basically 40% lower than it is for natives. And then we drop down to lawful immigrants, which are distinguishable in the census very clearly, and they have an incarceration rate of 0.47. Now what's interesting is you can tell in the Bureau of Justice Statistics data how many people are incarcerated merely for immigration offenses, or how many people are held in detention when they've just crossed the border unlawfully. So what happens is when you subtract them out from the unlawful immigrant population, their incarceration rate drops to 0.5, which is about exactly the same as it is for lawful immigrants in the United States. So when people tell me that lawful immigrants or illegal immigrants and lawful ones are crime prone and we can't measure it, I like to show them this type of evidence that we published in March 15, 2007 in a paper, Criminal Immigrants, Their Numbers, Demographics, and Countries of Origin, to show them that it's really not the problem that they think this is. And by the way, if you go all the way back to the early 1900s, you take a look at every government commission, usually started to make immigrants look bad, studying this issue. The Dillingham Commission, commissions in the 1930s, even commissions in the 1990s, couldn't mess with the numbers enough to make it look like immigrants are more crime prone. All of them concluded, immigrants are bad, we don't like them, whatever, but they couldn't even trick the numbers enough to make them look more crime prone. That has continued to this day in this number. So in conclusion, very, very small risk of dying in a terrorist attack committed by a foreigner on U.S. soil. There are 768,000 murders in the United States between 1975 and 2015. 0.4% of that is terrorism. 255 times as likely to be murdered for a homicide per year than in a terrorist attack. And immigrants have lower incarceration rates than native-born Americans do. So I would just throw out there that if you're worried about immigration, if you're worried about immigrants because of the danger to life, liberty, or in private property of native-born Americans, then you should probably worry about other things. Thank you.
That was excellent. We have time for one question for Alex. Questions? Yes.
Not on. As loud as you can.
My name is Isaac Follett. I'm a recent college graduate, and you said since 9/11 there have been only 24 deaths by terrorism. Naturally, the response by surveillance proponents would be, well, that's because of the surveillance that we are conducting. What is your response to that, and how do we address that on the whole?
Yeah, so that number is for foreign-born terrorism. So there have been other terrorists in the United States who are native-born who aren't counted in that number. My response to that is to read the work of John Mueller, who's a political scientist at Ohio State University, and he runs through the nonsense that DHS funds, that surveillance states do to try to track down immigrants or terrorists. One of my favorite examples is some government official received an email from somebody saying, give me, and it was a $sign followed by 49 nines in a row, money, or I will bomb you, ha, 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 ha. And the government actually spent resources tracking this person down to like a kid in the Philippines. So I would say that given the small amount of threats out there, given the small amount of terrorists who actually fulfill them, and given the amount of resources they waste on chasing ghosts like that, as well as the fact that DHS does not do cost-benefit analyses of its anti-terrorism actions to figure out what is an efficient use of these resources, tells me, and the few number of Americans who are actually killed in these attacks, tells me that there really aren't that many attacks that have been foiled. If there were a lot of successes, if there were a lot of achievements that they could point to, they would be pointing to them. They would be waving the names from the rooftops. They would be telling us about them nonstop to get more budget funding and more power to monitor what we do in our daily lives. And the fact that they don't have that, the fact that they don't have those names to be able to wave in front of Congress and everybody else to get this power, tells me that they don't even believe their own nonsense. So thank you.
Check, check. Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Alex. One of the themes of this conference is borders. Not just borders on land, but borders between people. How do we police those borders? How do we decide who is an immigrant and who belongs? This is not a metaphor. And what I mean by that is that in 1790, Congress passed a law restricting citizenship to, quote, free white persons, close quote. And so in the early 20th century, courts were called on to actually adjudicate who was white and who was not. So how do you prove that you're white? One way, as Professor Shirali Munshi will explain, is to photograph yourself and your family and prove it. Prove that you look white. Welcome, Professor Munshi, and Harrison will cue up your PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you to the conference organizers for putting together this incredible program, and I'm especially honored to join this amazing panel of scholars who've played such an important role in illuminating histories of racialized exclusion and offering important correctives to new nativist accounts of immigration. I'm going to talk a little bit quickly with your forbearance because I see that sign popping up over there. So when we talk about race and surveillance, we're often talking about a set of government practices that interfere with some sense of individual liberty. In my presentation, I want to call attention to a more quotidian form of racial surveillance, the many ways in which Americans have become accustomed to looking at one another for signs of difference, for evidence of threat, or proof of membership, increasingly with resentment and revulsion. And by focusing on two early 20th century cases, both involving Indian immigrants who were denied citizenship on, quote, racial grounds, I want to call attention to the ways in which law has always been implicated in institutionalizing and generalizing certain forms of racial looking, certain kinds of racial scrutiny. In the United States, racial order has long been maintained, I want to argue, not only through the repressive force of law, but through law's organization of the perceptual world, our social landscape. So the Naturalization Act of 1790, as Alvaro just mentioned, restricted citizenship to free white persons. After the Civil War, that was amended to extend citizenship to emancipated African Americans. The Naturalization Act posed few hurdles to immigration or naturalization until the turn of the 20th century, when people from Asia and the Middle East began immigrating to the United States in larger numbers. And with the arrival of these, quote, new immigrants, then courts found themselves under pressure to administer a more restrictive interpretation of the Naturalization Act, and especially those words, free white persons. So who are comprehended within the phrase free white persons? The Supreme Court addressed this question for the first time in 1922 in Ozawa versus the United States. Takao Ozawa, an immigrant from Japan, argued that he was a white person, among other reasons, because his skin looked white. The court acknowledged as much, but declined to adopt the color test that Ozawa had proposed. Instead, the court held that the words free white person should be interpreted to refer to Caucasians. So confronted with the variability of skin color, or perhaps even the vulgarity of visual inspection, the court sought recourse in the supposed certainty and respectability of racial scientific discourse. But only a few months later, the court was forced to reconsider its reliance on race science when Bhagat Singh Thind, a Punjabi Sikh, argued that because he happened to belong to the group of people considered Caucasians by ethnologists and linguists, he was a white person and therefore eligible for citizenship. And not surprisingly, the court disagreed. Justice George Sutherland, writing for a unanimous court, was forced then to clarify the court's earlier decision. And what it said was, what we now hold is that the words free white persons are words of common speech to be interpreted with the understanding of the common man. Whatever may be the speculations of the ethnologists, it does not include the body of people to whom Thind belongs. The court acknowledged that quote, while it may be true that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity, the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today. So in Thind, the authority to designate racial qualification for citizenship is suddenly withdrawn from the old race experts and instead reinvested in the perceptual capacity and now cultivated racial instincts of the average white American. In the court's analysis, Hindus were unassimilable in a very peculiar sense. The courts recognized that while individual Indian immigrants had proven themselves capable of cultural assimilation, as a group, Indians were incapable of naturalization because they, quote, retained their physical group characteristics. In other words, they were visually unassimilable, unlike their European counterparts who, quote, quickly merge into the mass of our population. In other words, Hindus could not be naturalized in the court's view because their appearance could not be reconciled with a white majority's vision of citizenship. So in Ozawa and Thind, as numerous commentators have observed, the court established a racial bar to naturalization, transforming the status of raced Asians as well as white Americans. And it's important here to recognize that alien Asian and native white are mutually constituted in this context. But the cases have a more lasting legacy in that they played an active role in recasting and recreating the racial reality it sought to govern, cleansing the American landscape of foreign elements, marking Asian bodies as with an indelible difference, and investing white Americans with the power to decide who belongs, who does not, while cultivating new forms of racial instinct and aversion. Shifting gears a little bit. Dinsha Goodyalli was one of a few dozen immigrants who the federal government sought to denaturalize after Thind was decided. Goodyalli, a Parsi Zoroastrian from Bombay, had immigrated to the United States in 1910 with his wife and 2 children. He became a naturalized citizen in 1917, the same year that Congress passed a law barring immigration from all of Asia. He made his home in New Jersey, where he hoped to establish himself as an inventor, but for all sorts of reasons instead earned notoriety as a quack. But over the course of his career, Goodyalli was arrested several times for violating laws regulating the practice of medicine, but it was after he was married to a white woman in 1923 that he became the target of increasingly racialized scrutiny. And here is a photograph or a record of one of his arrests, which I include only to highlight the ways in which Goodyalli, an individual who is constantly subject to racial scrutiny and suspicion, would exploit the conventional authority of even this unflattering record to make claims about his racial identity, right? He claims that he's white Persian in this record, to make claims about racial identity that his own words or his own body could not. So by the time the government notified Goodyalli that it would be canceling his citizenship on grounds of, quote, racial ineligibility, he'd been living in the United States for more than 20 years. He had established a business, bought a home, was raising 5 sons with his new wife. He remarried an American woman, as I mentioned, in 1923. He studiously avoided the more radical co-nationals who Professor Sohi writes about, and instead volunteered his services during the First World War. He denounced communism at every opportunity. But after Thind, of course, the relevant qualifications for citizenship were neither respectability nor loyalty, but again, racial identity. And again, Hindus were racially disqualified for citizenship because they would indefinitely retain their visual markers of difference, distinguishing themselves from other white Americans. So Goodyalli found himself in the very odd position then of having to defend his citizenship by convincing a judge that he looked white. So at his denaturalization trial, he submitted into evidence more than a dozen photographs of himself and his children, as well as his properties, assuring a federal judge, quote, "You will see that my family became so American." And it's on just a few of these photographs that I'll focus the remainder of my presentation. So how do these photographs purport to demonstrate that Goodyalli and his family had become, quote, so American? Do we see in these black and white images the imprint of color? To me, what's most striking about the photographs is the tension, many of us may be familiar with, between the inevitable appearance of what the Thind court referred to as racial difference on the one hand, and the labored performance of national belonging on the other. So Goodyalli, identified as a Parsi Zoroastrian in this publicity photo, it's not as proud as an identification as it may seem at first glance. I'm inclined to read it instead as a kind of disidentification, as if to explain to his American counterparts, I'm not one of those bad Indians, I'm a good Indian, right? In ways that are painfully familiar today. And indeed, at his denaturalization trial, Gudyali insisted over and over, "I am not Hindu." Hindus are racially ineligible for citizenship. So how does this publicity card, again, attempt to naturalize Gudyali and his family? How do they purport to demonstrate citizenship worthiness? Well, here Gudyali is bent over his children, playing the part of a good patriarch, fulfilling a certain kind of civic duty. His children, in turn, appear to be good children, cooperative, pliable. The kind of citizenship projected here is one defined by work and self-reliance rather than, say, love of democracy. It's a kind of entrepreneurialism, but an entrepreneurialism within limits. In much of his autobiographical writing, Gudyali represents himself as an outrageously ambitious individual. But here, the promise or threat of upward mobility is carefully contained in the humbled shoulders and the averted gaze. One can't help but notice the artifice of the image, the contrived photography of the bodies depicted. No one is looking at the camera. Instead, the bodies are torqued as if on display, in compliance with the photographer's instructions, but also perhaps open to the kinds of inspection that we've already heard about more generally, kinds of inspection that begin at the border, as Professor Nye mentioned. Conspicuously absent from this image also is a picture of Gudyali's first wife, Manek, with whom he had immigrated. She disappears from Gudyali's narrative for reasons that are never announced, but not hard to imagine, and for reasons that we've already heard, given that Asian women immigrating to the United States were treated as presumptive prostitutes and subject to surveillance long after their entry. Her disappearance afforded Gudyali another opportunity, however, to join the American family, and that was by marrying into it. His second wife, however, a woman named Irene Grace, is also conspicuously absent from his family album, or at least the photographs that Gudyali submitted to the court, and surely to avoid the specter of miscegenation, which we also heard about already. Instead, he relies on this image of his 5 mixed-race children, small, medium, and large, to suggest something of his ultimate incorporation into the national body. In Thind, the court announced that the children of, quote, Hindu parents could never assimilate, no matter how disciplined, because they would, again, indefinitely retain clear evidence of their ancestry. But here, Americanness is more easily represented by the children themselves, their lighter skin, the ease with which they seem to inhabit their environment, here a natural setting in this photo. Compare the confident gaze of these children with the compliant look of Gudyali's Indian children. Compare the way in which they're shown at play, enjoying childhood, while the other children are shown at work. This contrast between the children's images, I think, vivifies the different claim to citizenship enjoyed by the natural born and the naturalized. For the natural born, the rights and privileges of citizenship flow naturally, as if a matter of birthright. For those who appear otherwise or are marked by racial difference, the kind constructed by Thind, citizenship is conditioned upon a performance. Here, spectacular displays of self-discipline and conformity. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. So, thank you all again for coming. We are going to take a 15-minute break for coffee outside, and if Professor Munchie's scholarship interested you, or if any of the scholarship that's been mentioned so far is of interest, please follow the hashtag #ColorOfSurveillance on Twitter for links to all of these articles. Thank you. We'll see you at 10:40 when Professor Arjun Sethi will be speaking, and you will not want to miss it. So we'll see you soon. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We will begin. After September 11th, the American government sought to go into Muslim communities, build relationships, and win over hearts and minds to counter extremism. Professor Arjun Sethi from Georgetown Law will explain how these programs often devolved into community surveillance programs that track those very hearts and minds they meant to connect with and persuade. A turn that, in his view, has done little to combat genuine terrorism. Please welcome Professor Arjun Sethi.
Welcome, everyone. Very happy to be with you today. So my remarks are going to focus on countering violent extremism programs. These programs seek to identify young Muslim Americans who the government believes are at risk of becoming violent extremists, right? So these are predictive programs. So my remarks today will focus on what these programs are. I'll then provide a broader context, and then I will give you some food for thought about how these programs are ineffective, chill civil rights, and lead to the profiling of Muslim Americans. So again, what are these programs? CVE programs, in some form or shape, began to be rolled out a few years ago and sought to identify, in particular, Muslim American youth who at one point in time in the future could become violent extremists. So these programs have been rolled out in really 3 different ways. Some years ago, the Obama administration rolled out pilot CVE programs in 3 US cities: Boston, Los Angeles, and Minneapolis. And these programs asked community leaders, so imams, youth coaches, teachers, etc., to again identify Muslim youth who, in their opinion, were exhibiting signs of radicalization, and to then share those names with law enforcement. So again, the idea that somehow there are these indicators that are universal, that are discernible, that community leaders could identify, and then provide those names to law enforcement. So those were the pilot programs that were rolled out a few years ago. We then had a program called Don't Be a Puppet. This is a web interface. It's like a game of some kind that the FBI rolled out, again, about 2 years ago, which was intended for teachers to use in school curricula. So again, that they too, based on these certain indicators, could identify Muslim American youth who are at risk of becoming violent extremists. FBI's Don't Be a Puppet website is online. You can check it out. And again, it has these indicators. The third program was a program called Shared Responsibility Committees. And what these programs tried to do was they tried to assemble a team of professionals, right? So again, maybe an imam, maybe a coach, maybe a YMCA official, maybe a government official, certainly somebody from law enforcement, who again would form a committee and intervene to help a Muslim American youth who the government had determined is at risk of becoming a violent extremist. Right? So these are the 3 programs. That's the landscape of CVE in a nutshell in the last few years. So broader context. I ask you today to think about CVE not in isolation, but think about it really as a form of predictive policing. I don't know how many of you have heard of predictive policing, but predictive policing is based on the idea that we can use big data, right, to predict when a crime will occur or who will commit a crime. So typically, predictive policing is based on either threat scores that are assigned to particular individuals or hot spots. Again, the idea that there will be a certain location, space in a city, for example, the government can look at historical trends, historical data, and devote resources to that area or to individuals based on threat scores, and again, stop a crime before it occurs. And I would suggest to you today that predictive policing has been a miserable failure. They have disproportionately impacted communities of color. They have led to profiling of communities of color. They have little transparency, and perhaps most fundamentally, especially speaking at a law school today, they subvert basic time-tested principles and standards, like reasonable suspicion, probable cause. You don't have to be a lawyer to know that we all have the right to go about our business, right? We all have the right to privacy. Predictive policing programs, we have the right to privacy unless, right, there is reasonable suspicion to believe that you have committed a crime, or probable cause to arrest you if, again, there is probable cause to believe that you've committed a crime. So CVE, like predictive policing programs, doesn't rely on time-tested standards like reasonable suspicion or probable cause, right? It tries to intervene very early on in a way that subverts those standards. And secondly, and this is the last thing I'll say about sort of the broader context in which you should understand CVE, is understand that CVE programs are part of a broader architecture of various surveillance programs that the government has rolled out and intensified after 9/11 that profile and disproportionately impact Muslim and Arab Americans. Example, watch lists. Under the US terrorist watch list system, you can be branded a terrorist if either you are a known terrorist or if there is reasonable suspicion to believe that you are a suspected terrorist. Think about how attenuated that is. In fact, the guidance is so broad that the US government can brand you a terrorist on the basis of a single social media post. And that's why Dearborn, Michigan, a city with fewer than 100,000 residents, has more people on the terrorist watch list than any other city in the country except for New York. So watch lists are another example of a program like CVE that disproportionately profile and impact Muslim Americans. Another example of sort of this broader architecture that helps you understand, again, CVE programs. Suspicious activity reporting. So one of the perceived intelligence failures prior to 9/11 was that there was no mechanism for local law enforcement to report what they perceived to be suspicious activity to federal law enforcement. So really what you saw after 9/11 was an intensification of this program called suspicious activity reporting, which is actually not too dissimilar from CVE, but it has important differences. But again, the idea was that local law enforcement should be able to have some type of mechanism to report suspicious activity to law enforcement. The problem is what counts as suspicious activity? According to the federal government, it's pre-terrorism planning. It's pre-intelligence planning. So what does that include? I will tell you. It includes things like Arab and Muslim Americans going to Best Buy and purchasing home computers for their home business. It includes Muslim and Arab Americans taking photos of national monuments. It includes searching for video games online. In one case, it included an Arab American going to Costco and buying pallets of water. All of those examples I just gave you are real cases. All of those individuals performed those activities, which are obviously protected under the Constitution, right? Which we all have the right to do. And yet all of them, in some form or another, were visited by law enforcement or the intelligence community because that was perceived to be indicia of future terrorist behavior. So with that background, let me tell you a little bit specifically about why these CVE programs don't work. Again, this predictive policing model, as we've seen time and again, doesn't work because it upends basic fundamental standards that we can all agree on, like reasonable suspicion, probable cause. And again, it's part of this broader architecture, specifically about CVE. First and foremost, the programs are based on junk science. So everyone, shouldn't say everyone because there's always going to be junk scientists out there, but anybody who is of repute, who has actually looked at the phenomena of violent extremism, has found that there are no universal indicators that can predict when an individual or whether an individual will become a violent extremist. You don't have to take my word for it. The British intelligence community some years ago performed an exhaustive study where they interviewed and looked at dozens and dozens of instances of individuals who had embraced violent extremism. And that's exactly what they found, namely that there is no single path to violent extremism. So let me ask you this. If there is no single path to violent extremism, if there are no universal indicators, if it can't be discerned from an outside observer, how do you predict violent extremism? What are the indicators? I will tell you. The government has just made them up. So the indicators the government uses to predict when a Muslim American youth is likely to become a violent extremist include things like, and this is verbatim from government documents and speeches, becoming confrontational at home, a newfound interest in religiosity, using code words, using encrypted applications, traveling to conflict zones overseas, ideological differences, right? These aren't indicators of violent extremism. These are activities that, again, are protected under the First Amendment. These are activities that are protected under basic notions of privacy that I think we can all agree on in the context of civil rights law and human rights law. So in using these flawed indicators, what happens? CVE programs have led to a chilling of basic civil rights in Muslim American and immigrant communities. People are worried that if they express a newfound interest in religiosity, if they grow a beard, if they wear a hijab, if they join an MSA, if they join a Muslim charity, if they attend a protest condemning US drone strikes, if they attend a counter rally to one of the anti-Sharia marches, anti-Sharia marches that took place a few weeks ago, that somehow they will be profiled by law enforcement, right? So these programs have led to a basic chilling of constitutional civil rights and human rights. Basic rights like expression, association, etc. They've also led to profiling. So for me, the case study is and always has been Ahmed Muhammad, right? The young black Muslim boy in Texas who created a homemade clock, and everyone just assumed it was a bomb. So in the age of CVE, Muslim Americans, immigrants, run the risk that any time they express an interest in Islam, any time they show an interest in even things like engineering, right? Express political beliefs, join political associations, they will somehow be construed as a future violent extremist. They will be visited by law enforcement. They will be subject to different kinds of surveillance that you will hear about today as well. I would also add in this context that I'm not alone in denouncing these programs. National teacher associations, health professional associations, psychologists have all come out and said that these programs are based on bad science. In many cases, they don't just lead to profiling of Muslim Americans immigrant communities, they lead to bullying in our schools. I talked to you a little bit earlier about the Don't Be a Puppet program. How the hell is a teacher supposed to determine whether a student in her class is one day going to become a violent extremist? It's absurd. The last thing I will say specifically about these programs is that they are entirely incommensurate with the threat posed. So, as far as we know right now, no CVE intervention has led to a single sort of a terrorist act prevention. And furthermore, if you look at basic statistics, in the United States, you are far more likely to be harmed or injured by a white supremacist than you are by a Muslim immigrant or refugee. So the fact remains is that these programs are entirely incommensurate with the threat posed, and yet we see time and again that our government routinely wants to ignore threats like white supremacy and double and triple down on these broken intelligence policing hybrid programs that chill constitutional rights, that lead to profiling, and really aren't effective. I think we might have time for 1 minute for questions or 20 20 seconds or 2, 3, 20 seconds? Or maybe we'll just take 2 questions together and I'll try to answer both together. We actually do not. Okay. I've been overruled, my friends. Thank you.
Wonderful. A few weeks ago, Malkia Cyril sent me a poem by Alberto Rios about the border. Let me read you some excerpts from it. It's called The Border, a double sonnet. The border is a line that birds cannot see. The border says stop to the wind, but the wind speaks another language and keeps going. The border used to be an actual place, but now it is the act of 1,000 imaginations. The border, the word border, sounds like order, but in this place they do not rhyme. In my mind, this poem speaks powerfully not just to the futility of the border, but also its new ambiguity. The border used to be an actual place, a crossing. Now the border is an investigation into who we are, what we think, what our devices say we think. And the machinery of that surveillance isn't limited to border checkpoints. And obviously, these investigations are old, as we saw from today's panel. But they have first panel about the Chinese exclusion, but obviously they have expanded since then. The machinery of surveillance comes to define and pervade every community it touches, even places up to 100 miles away. I'm thrilled to moderate this panel on how border surveillance has been changing and what it looks like today. We'll begin with Hassan Shibli. And as folks are mic'd, if they want to come and join us on stage, we'll begin with Hassan Shibli of the Council on American Islamic Relations of Florida, who will talk about border searches and interrogations before and after the Muslim ban. He will speak from personal and legal experience. Then we will turn to Professor Patricia Macias Rojas of the University of Illinois at Chicago, who conducted an ethnography of life in actual border communities, places where sometimes the ratio of Border Patrol agents to residents is 1 to 17. Think about that for a moment. That is lower than the student-to-teacher ratio in many states. Finally, we will turn to Patrick Eddington of the Cato Institute. As the poet Rio said, the border used to be an actual place. Now, under regulations issued in the 1950s, the Border Patrol can conduct border searches anywhere within 100 miles of the border. And so Patrick will discuss those checkpoints. We will begin with Hassan.
Good morning, everyone. It's a tremendous honor and privilege to speak before all of you today, and I want to thank Alvaro and the Georgetown Law for hosting this critical program, because problems at the border isn't something new for me. I remember last night when I was actually crossing the border from Canada, and they asked me, where are you going? I said, I'm actually going to Georgetown. Why? Well, I'm going to speak about how you guys treat us at the border. I never had such a smooth experience crossing the border as I did that day. And in fact, he admitted, he said, yeah, what's happening to you guys at the border is BS. That was literally his language. He said the Muslim ban was unnecessary. It doesn't help keep this country safe. Most of the time we're holding you guys for no real reason. And frankly, it's used for intelligence gathering. And that's the truth. And I can tell you, every single time I visit Canada, I feel welcome. Since I've been a child, every time I visit my country, America, I feel like a suspect, like a criminal. And frankly, I think it's quite a traumatizing experience. The problems with Muslims crossing the border into America, or let me say this, the problem of Americans crossing into America based on their religion did not start with Donald Trump. It's been happening for quite a long time. And what really changed my life was back in 2005, I was in my first year at UB Law School, at undergrad at that time, and coming back from a conference late at night, and we're getting to the border slowly, and as we get to the border, my mom, rolls down the window, it's snowing outside, it's cold, it's midnight, and they say, where were you? She said, we're at an Islamic conference in Toronto. She said, ma'am, we'd like you to go in for a random inspection. So my mom, who wears the headscarf and is professor of orthodontics at the University of New York at Buffalo, said, what do you mean random? I said, Mom, random means they saw your headscarf. But I didn't think that would be the actual case. And yet, when I woke up my little sister and my brother, carried them into secondary inspection, I was shocked. I literally felt like I was in my local mosque. There was over 40 members of the American Muslim community. We were held overnight till about 6 a.m., so 6 hours. We were fingerprinted, photographed, frisked, literally put on the wall, legs kicked open. My mom, as she was crying, taking her biometrics. Meanwhile, non-citizens were in and out in 15 minutes. And I told the officers, I said, sir, while you're wasting time with this elderly couple, these babies that are crying, us just because of our religion, real criminals could be getting by. And he said, sir, I'm afraid of the same exact thing. And sure enough, the next day I read in the New York Times that a man who killed an entire family in Canada made it across the border with the bloody weapons in his car. But he wasn't stopped because he looked more like Trump and less like me. That's the truth. Profiling doesn't work. It makes our country less safe, and it makes us less free. Because the conversation within the American Muslim community now is, should we be hiding our identity so we don't get picked on by U.S. Customs? And unfortunately, the data supports the fact that, and it's probably through disparate impact. I don't think there's a sheet that says if you're Muslim, stop them. That would be clearly unconstitutional. But there's a lot of facially neutral criteria which pretty much results in a highly disproportionate number of American Muslims being singled out at the border. What I've actually done is spot check. So I will go into secondary inspection and I will count out how many people are visibly Muslim in the room. I've often documented cases where it's 50 to 75% of the people who are stopped are members of the American Muslim community. At the same time, when I go into a gathering with majority Muslim population, I ask them, how many of you have been stopped by U.S. Customs and held for random inspections? About 50% raise their hand. I say, how many of you filed complaints? About 1%. People are scared because you know what happens when you file complaints? We've documented a number of times where when people file complaints, the next thing that happens is FBI show up at their home or at their office and start interrogating them and maybe start pushing them to become informants. The Intercept has done excellent work exposing how the data gathered by U.S. Customs is then used by the FBI for intel gathering and then informant recruitment. And they're not just informants, they're actually being pushed into agent provocateur and entrapment operations, which is a whole separate topic that hopefully we can discuss in a future convening. And this continues to hit home. In the month leading up to Trump's inauguration, I actually remember I was going skiing with my brother. And we were supposed to meet at noon, and it's 2 o'clock, he doesn't show up. So I call him, I'm like, Akram, where are you? He said, I was held at the border for the last 2 hours. They demanded my cell phone. They made me turn over my password. They downloaded all the data off of it. I said, Akram, you're under no legal obligation, and this is a point for all of you, you're under no legal obligation to provide your password or unlock your phone. Yes, they may take the phone away, but they can do that even if you unlock it. Now, 3 days later, my brother was again traveling across the border. This time, turn over your cell phone. No. Immediately, within a second, they choked him, slammed him to the ground, forcibly removed the cell phone off of him, using arguably lethal force to search electronics without suspicion, without a warrant. Mind you, that in the Riley case, domestically, the police, even if they arrest you, cannot search your phone without a warrant in most circumstances. So why is it different at the border? And this is where those who are in Congress, those who work for members of Congress, we really need to push for change in the legislation, while at the same time we are working for change through the courts. Now, the interesting thing is that the Buffalo News did a story to see what happened, to tell the story of my brother. And they interviewed one of the border agents, and what one of the border agents said was, well, think about it. If you have a car of 2 teenagers, a car of 2 grandmas, and a car of 2 Muslim men, who do you pull over for secondary inspection? Let me rephrase that. If you have a car of 2 teenagers, 2 grandmas, and 2 Jewish men, who do you pull over? 2 African American men, who do you pull over? Him making that argument proved the point that there is systematic profiling. Right now, federal law does not close the loopholes on religious profiling by federal officials. The loopholes are too big for religious profiling. I think it's disproportionate targeting that's happening, unfortunately, that's leading to a lot of American Muslims, growing up throughout. I remember, and I'll finish sort of with these points, crossing the border as a child, or not as a teenager, taking my grandma to visit her sister. And within a minute, I was in handcuffs. There was no resistance, there was no argument, standard procedure. And my message to people within the administration at the time was, how do you think it feels to grow up as an American Muslim, where every time you're crossing the border, or half the time you're crossing the border, you're held for hours, and you're in handcuffs? you're treated like a criminal. It could make you hate this country. It could reinforce the message of our extremists. Now, thank God it pushed me to build one of the largest civil rights organizations in the state of Florida to counter this, CARE Florida. And I'm proud of it. So thank you, Customs, for inspiring me to do that. But the problem isn't going away. We need to challenge it. And just recently, as a final point, we documented that throughout the United States in the month leading up to the Trump administration, because when my brother was pulled over, I sort of did a little Facebook Live video. It got a lot of views, and a lot of people started contacting us about their stories at the border. And we documented how U.S. Customs was singling out Americans, including Muhammad Ali's own son and ex-wife, who we're helping right now and assisting, and asking them the following questions. Are you a devout Muslim? How many times a day do you pray? What mosque do you go to? What school of thought do you follow? What do you think of Donald Trump? What do you think of killing Americans? What do you think of killing civilians? All based on their religion, being asked about their religion. This isn't about targeting Muslims. It's about targeting Americans in violation of the First Amendment, and we really need to close the loopholes that make this possible. Thank you, and God bless you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Can you hear me? Hello, hello, wonderful. Now we'll hear from Professor Patricia Macias Rojas from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Professor Macias Rojas conducted an in-depth ethnography of life in border communities. And I highly recommend her book, which I hope she will mention during the presentation. I believe it's the Prison to Deportation Pipeline, and Chapter 5 in particular is exactly on point for our purposes today. With that, I'll turn it over to Professor Macias Rojas.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So, yes, so I began researching immigration enforcement in U.S.-Mexico border communities over a decade ago. I actually began the fieldwork just before 9/11 and conducted a bulk of it in its aftermath at a time when the former Immigration Service was reorganized under what we now know today as the Department of Homeland Security. So then as now, those were dark days, and it wasn't entirely clear yet how the federal government's war on terror would unfold and what the consequences would be for immigrant communities. So when I began the ethnography, actually on my very first day of doing fieldwork at a migrant shelter in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, I was in an auto accident. I was actually coming back from the shelter, and I took a taxi to the port of entry in Nogales, and it was late. I was rushing back, which aroused suspicion from the immigration agent, who questioned the whereabouts and authenticity of my passport. So this is routine practice at the border. So once he eventually waved me through, I caught a shuttle up to Tucson. So everything happened quickly. 20 miles from the border, a tire blew out, the driver lost control, the van swerved across the lanes and drove off the highway, flipped over, and landed in the desert brush. In my field notes that night, I wrote, "Adrenaline racing. I can't believe we survived. I could hear the moans of people in the back. The driver stepped on my face trying to break the windshield to get out. Someone pulled me out quickly, afraid that the van would catch fire. We all got out safely. Border Patrol showed up even before the paramedics. I watched them shine flashlights on people, no doubt trying to identify if we were undocumented. They made everyone squat on the ground the way they do when they apprehend people. I refused to squat, ignored their orders. A paramedic asked for my social security number. I declined to give it." So the handling of that accident blurred the lines between a migrant apprehension and a criminal arrest and captures the complexity of border security, U.S.-Mexico border security, that I want to talk about today. So in this case, the agents weren't just checking our immigration status, they were sorting us according to criminal status too. And once they confirmed our criminal and legal status, that the driver wasn't smuggling us into the country, then they turned the case over to the paramedics. Only then did the handling of the accident shift from a crime scene to a medical intervention. So what I witnessed on the ground back then wasn't matching up with the rhetoric of fighting terrorism and intercepting weapons of mass destruction. What I saw in practice then was little more than crime control extended to an immigration context. So in the remainder of my time, I'd like to turn our attention to the crime politics of the 80s and 90s that created new enforcement targets that have fundamentally transformed immigration enforcement and border policing. And then I'll turn to how these enforcement priorities play out in border communities. So during the Reagan era, as you know, right, Black and Latino youth were disproportionately pushed into prisons, right? And legislators at the time knew that the system didn't have the capacity. They didn't have the cells or the beds to warehouse that many people. So rather than to rethink these policies that were packing too many people in already overcrowded prisons, they turned the problem into an issue of bed space, not enough prison beds. So you see in the historical record that I've looked at, legislators scrambling to come up with ways to deal with overcrowding and expand the capacity of prisons. You see Congress then investing in prison expansion and turning to the private sector to manage and build more prisons. So it's in this scramble for beds that the idea came out to go after non-citizens swept up in the drug war. So in 1989, it was estimated that there were approximately 10,000 non-citizens in prisons for low-level drug offenses. And so legislators said, you know, if we could deport these people, we could make more beds available. And so it's at that time that non-citizens with convictions became an enforcement priority in the immigration system. But targeting immigrants with convictions would not be easy, since an estimated 55% were legal immigrants with protections in the system. So to implement this, Congress had to statutorily transform deportation and detention, which it did under the 1996 Immigration Act, right? In other words, these new enforcement priorities required a rolling out of several legal mechanisms to make it happen. The use of information technology to track people with criminal history, the implementation of fast-track methods of deportation, expansion of detention beds, cooperation between immigration and local law enforcement. I mean, these are many of the policies that we associate with the criminalization of migration today. So now these new enforcement priorities and this transformation of immigration and border policing has had a profound impact, I think, on border communities in southern Arizona. So these are just some images from a dear friend that will just be in the background. But so these are predominantly Latino low-income communities. Most of the residents in the communities are not, in fact, immigrants. In Nogales, for instance, 95% are Latino. There's a per capita income of $14,000, and roughly 60% are citizens. In Douglas, it's 82% Latino with a per capita income of $13,000. 70% are U.S. citizens. So in these communities, then, where I was conducting the fieldwork, every day, 24 hours a day, Border Patrol vehicles drive up and down the streets, and it's uncommon to walk for more than 5 minutes without encountering an agent. So when I started the fieldwork, there were 2,200. Today, that number has more than doubled to 42 for the entire sector. So every single person I spoke with in these communities, because at the time I was conducting a survey in 5 border communities right on the border. I'm not talking about Phoenix. I'm not talking about Tucson. I'm talking about the communities right on the line. All of them had been pulled over at some point, multiple times on criminal grounds. So it wasn't so much that agents thought they were undocumented, they were targeting them as criminal suspects, as potential smugglers. And so they interrogated, confiscated the property of, prosecuted, incarcerated, and even deported local residents for immigration violations, like smuggling, with regular occurrence. And so border residents often didn't have the economic or political resources to challenge the charges brought against them. So I'm going to quickly just share some excerpts before wrapping up. And in this one excerpt, I'm visiting the home of a local school teacher, and she doesn't really want to talk to me, but she warms up eventually, and she says, it's gotten to a point where you can't help someone because they think you're a smuggler. The woman next door had, pigs in the back, and she built a pen. Well, the smugglers would hide people out there, and she got punished for it. We had to get dogs out and back because we don't want anyone back there. They'll take you to jail. They'll take your house, your car, your papers. The other day, a woman came to my door and asked if I could give her some water. She had a baby bottle, so I filled it, and she drank it, and she asked for more. She asked me to fill it like 4 times. I felt bad for her and asked her where the baby was. She said she left the baby hiding. I filled up a gallon for her, and Border Patrol passed by and picked her up. He started yelling at me and told me I couldn't do that. And I said to him, if someone comes to my house and asks me for water, I will give it. I don't work for the Border Patrol. That's your job. So in more extreme cases, women had told me they confessed to being cavity searched for drugs. Other residents had been beaten. Others spoke of Border Patrol shootings. Since 2010, there have been at least 6 fatal Border Patrol shootings in southern Arizona alone, and 3 non-fatal shootings. So one woman shared an account of one that happened just after the buildup in the 1990s, and she said, it's like a war zone here. There were 40 to 60 people running through, helicopters flying all night, shining lights through here. A 13-year-old girl got shot by a Border Patrol. She set up a tent out in back and was playing camp, and at about 3 o'clock, she heard dogs and got scared. She was running back home with her backpack when a Border Patrol shot her in the knee from behind. The Border Patrol said she was carrying drugs in her backpack. Her family complained, but they didn't get anything. So the family filed that formal complaint and followed the grievance procedures, yet they were never compensated because the agents classified the 13-year-old girl as a smuggler. So my point here is to call attention to the overreach of enforcement priorities. Border residents, many of whom are not immigrants, are classified as criminal through search and seizure practices, through criminal prosecution and incarceration, and even deportation. So there actually are cases of citizen residents who have been deported. So enacted on the ground, these new enforcement mandates extend the collateral consequences of a conviction to an immigration and border context. The stigma of being labeled a criminal justifies a negation of personhood regardless of citizenship. So the diffusion of DHS enforcement priorities institutionalize a linkage between membership and criminal history that I believe is actually rooted in anti-Blackness, whereby the citizen becomes the antithesis to the criminal. So to wrap up, what I've really tried to do here is to draw on my historical and ethnographic research to shed light on some of these transformations in contemporary border security. Other historians here have spoken of these earlier periods, which are fundamentally important. And I've tried to show with my work how the period of the 80s and 90s at the height of mass incarceration matters and is crucial for really understanding the Department of Homeland Security's current enforcement priorities. I really think we have to pay attention to them because they're not going away. If anything, they're being exported globally to justify indefinite detention, torture, and drone strikes. These enforcement targets, as you know, they can't exist without the technological infrastructure that makes them workable. The implementation of these priorities depends on technology and surveillance. The INS wasn't able to do any of this until it developed these biometric technologies. So I do believe it's important for us to pay more attention and move beyond the political rhetoric of good and bad immigrants and really trace the history of these criminal enforcement priorities to see what they're really about. When you look into their history, they were never really about crime or immigration, but rather a political rhetoric that candidates from Goldwater to the current administration have used to win elections.
Now we will turn to Patrick Eddington of the Cato Institute under a regulation issued in, I believe it was the 1950s, and there's an excellent ACLU memorandum written by a friend, Chris Rickard, online that will explain its origins. The Border Patrol is authorized to conduct border searches not within 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, 4 miles, but within 100 miles of the border. And so Patrick Eddington will discuss what that means, what these look like, what the law is, what the law should be, and everything in between. Patrick.
Alvaro, thank you so very much. My thanks to your colleagues as well here, my fellow Hoyas at CPT, for inviting me to be a part of this today. Everybody can hear me okay? Am I good? All right. I've been in Washington almost 30 years, and I will tell you that I thought I had heard of everything until in the fall of 2014, I left the House of Representatives as a staffer and went to work at the Cato Institute and took over the DHS portfolio, essentially, and began to kind of dig in on some of these issues. And when I worked on the Hill, I dealt with TSA-related stuff, the porno scanners. We did manage to get those out of the airport, one of the very few post-9/11 victories for privacy and civil liberties. The downside was they put them in the Bureau of Prisons. You can kind of guess what that means. But I was amazed, horrified, stunned to learn that these things called internal checkpoints existed in the United States of America. So that's put me on the path of exploring this topic, and I want to share a few things with you today. This kind of gives you a ground level view of part of the Laredo checkpoint. Alvaro just mentioned this entire thing. How did this all come about? How did we get to a place where a group of bureaucrats in the Department of Justice in 1953 get the bright idea that we should have this, that we should have an internal zone in the United States that can stretch as far as 100 miles. And just to make sure everybody gets the point here, we're talking about encompassing essentially the biggest cities in the United States. We right now are in the border zone according to Customs and Border Protection, sitting in McDonough Hall here at Georgetown Law. It encompasses Miami, New York City, Boston, LA, Chicago. 2/3 of the U.S. population, by the estimate of our friends at the American Civil Liberties Union. So this gets created in the 1950s, and we roll along, and when we finally get a challenge to this in the 1970s. This is kind of a snapshot from a GAO report that was issued in 2009. Those dots represent fixed checkpoints. That map's not accurate. I'm engaged in a project at Cato right now to actually map these things throughout the United States. I can tell you it's more like 40 of these things that stretch essentially from Southern California all the way through Texas. I'll get into that project in more in just a minute. But what I wanted to be able to give you a sense of here is the fact that in 1976, a Supreme Court decision called U.S. versus Martinez-Fuerte was handed down. It involved 3 separate incidents with respect to the transportation of undocumented persons into the United States, and it examined the question of whether the use of such checkpoints for warrantless seizures and visual inspections, read searches, violated the Fourth Amendment. And Justice Powell, writing for the majority at the time, asserted that given the huge problem of undocumented immigration and CBP's responsibility to prevent it, under the, quote, circumstances of these checkpoint stops which do not involve searches, think about that for a second, the government or public interest in making such stops outweigh the constitutionally protected interest of the private citizen. In summary, we hold that stops for brief routine questioning, not further defined, conducted at permanent checkpoints are consistent with the Fourth Amendment and need not be authorized by warrant. Now, if that leaves your head scratching, Justices Brennan and Marshall had exactly the same reaction, and in their dissent, they noted, quote, the court assumes, and I certainly agree, that persons stopped at fixed checkpoints, whether or not referred to as secondary detention area, are seized within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment. Moreover, since the vehicle and its occupants are subjected to visual inspection, the intrusion clearly exceeds mere physical restraint, for officers are able to see more in a stopped vehicle than in vehicles traveling at normal speeds down the highway. They went on to say, quote, finally, the court's argument fails for more basic reasons. There is no principle in the jurisprudence of fundamental rights which permits constitutional limitations to be dispensed with merely because they cannot be conveniently satisfied. Dispensing with reasonable suspicion as a prerequisite to stopping and inspecting motorists because the inconvenience of such a requirement would make it impossible to identify a given car as a possible carrier of aliens is no more justifiable than dispensing with probable cause as a prerequisite to the search of an individual because the inconvenience of such a requirement would make it impossible to identify a given person in a high crime area as a possible carrier of concealed weapons. From my perspective, the effect of the Martinez-Forte decision was that CBP agents were allowed to use the court's ruling to conduct immigration inspections, quote unquote, on any vehicle seeking to pass through the checkpoint. And CBP officers were instructed to inquire as to the citizenship of the drivers and passengers. What the decision did not require, and this is where the conflict comes in at these checkpoints over and over and over again, is that motorists actually answer the questions posed by CBP agents. Now, what are the consequences of, let's say, going through the Laredo checkpoint and not playing ball with CBP? Well, Greg Rosenberg found out in September 2014. He's a long-haul trucker and a naturalized American citizen from Armenia. He grew up in the Soviet system. He knows what these things look like. He knows what these things really mean. So Greg was stopped at this checkpoint on a late night in September of 2014. He was asked about his immigration status, and he asserted his constitutional rights. So from the agent's perspective, he's not white, he has an accent, he's asserting his rights. You can probably guess what happens next, but I'll give it to you kind of blow by blow. They dragged him out of his vehicle, they roughed him up, and they proceeded to hold him incommunicado for 19 days. 19 days. They actually filed a lawsuit against him in federal court. They wound up having to drop that because he was threatening to do exactly the same to them. I wish I could tell you that Rosenberg's case is unique, but as you heard from the speaker who preceded me, it simply isn't the case. Part of our problem is that we don't have a good sense of the magnitude of just exactly how much of this happens. We got a slight glimpse of just exactly how crazy these checkpoints really are in terms of their inefficiency when the Government Accountability Office did what amounts to the only large-scale survey so far back in 2009. And what they found is that these checkpoints utilize 4% of CBP's personnel but only account for 2% of actual detentions of folks trying to enter this country illegally. So right there you've got a manpower mismatch, a resource mismatch, in addition to rights violations that are taking place. And the Arizona chapter of the ACLU has been engaged in a lot of litigation on this, FOIA and otherwise. And what they found in a report that they subsequently published called Record of Abuse, which you can find online, in the Tucson sector in 2013, apprehensions of undocumented persons accounted for 0.6% of the sector's total apprehensions. In calendar year 2013, 9 out of 23 Tucson sector checkpoints produced 0 arrests for deportable subjects. The same year in the Yuma sector, checkpoints arrests of U.S. citizens actually exceeded those of non-U.S. citizens by a factor of nearly 8, and in 2011 by a factor of 11. One checkpoint in the Yuma sector located 75 miles from the border reported only 1 non-citizen apprehension in 3 years, while producing multiple civil rights complaints during the same period. Now, as you can probably guess, our friends at the ACLU in Arizona are representing a number of litigants in lawsuits against CBP over exactly these kinds of detentions, and of course those continue to grind through the courts. I will tell you that I have had a FOIA in front of CBP on administrative appeal for 18 months now that seeks to get data nationally on this stuff. It's no real shock that they're stonewalling me, because I think if the numbers actually were to be put out there, it would absolutely blow people's minds. It's gotten so bad that in Arivaca, Arizona, where you've got at least 2 checkpoints that I know of, have become such an absolute problem for the people who live and work in that community that they have had confrontations with CBP agents on an almost daily basis, and they have set up their own citizen monitoring units to try to record the rights violations and other activities that are taking place at those checkpoints. The bottom line here is that these checkpoints are, existing court decisions notwithstanding, clearly in contravention of the intent of the founders with respect to the Fourth Amendment, and constitutional rights violations occur daily at these checkpoints. They're demonstrably ineffective, and thus a massive waste of taxpayer money. And for all of those reasons, they should be shut down. If I had a mic, I'd do a drop because I think I'm under my time.
You've heard plenty from me, so I want to open it up to 2 questions from the audience. The first hand I saw go up was you, sir. Ali, if you could give it to the gentleman in the lighter shirt furthest back. Thank you. And then we will turn to you. Wonderful. Excellent.
Hi, my name is Jeff Landale. I'm with the XLab program at Penn State University. I've noticed a common theme that was encapsulated by Pat Eddington's talk at the end, that these programs are demonstrably ineffective, a waste of taxpayer dollars, based on junk science. But I've also noticed another thread, which is that they all seem to have similar impacts. They are about the atomization of community, fraying of social bonds, where imams stop being spiritual leaders but become purveyors of surveillance and suspicion. Teachers stop trying to cultivate good habits and intelligence in children, but are instead building a sense of civic virtue on the idea of identifying potential terrorists or criminals. I'm wondering if our response to these programs changes if we stop taking their goal at their word, which they are demonstrably failing to achieve, and instead start assuming that their goal is the consistent, strong, and forceful impact that they are having. Does that change how we respond to these programs and how we put an end to them?
And we're going to go to the second question, so then the panel can answer both in tandem, please.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, nice.
Hello.
So my name is Luis. I'm a recent graduate from Grinnell College. I have no law degree, so my
You're still
question is
welcome
going to
here.
be... Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
From what I heard, my question stems from the standards of the people that get hired for those positions for agents. Like, who has the power to change those standards? Because I feel like, I don't know, like a week ago I talked to a cop and I asked him, how can you become a cop? And he just told me, you just need a high school education and pass a test, and the test is not even as hard as the SAT. So I wonder if this has an effect on the way they conduct themselves, right? How much education they have. I feel like we should raise the standards for all the agents to at least have an associate's degree and have requirements like take sociology classes and I don't know, just increase the standards. Who has the power to do that? Because I feel like if you're just coming out of high school, and I don't know if you guys remember your high school, it was very segregated, and you stuck to your own people, and you didn't have that chance to challenge your innate prejudices and how you see the world. So I wonder,
Excellent question. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I want to make sure you get an answer. So if folks on the panel want to, I think each of you is qualified to answer both of these questions. So do you want to start, Patrick?
So let me jump in and answer your question first with respect to standards. When left to its own devices, right, any agency or department will ultimately set its own standards unless Congress has done something from a statutory standpoint to do it. And your concern is exquisitely well grounded because this administration has talked about actually lowering the hiring standards for CBP. And we know that in some of these shooting cases that were referred to by my colleague up here, that some of the folks that were involved in that had previously been kicked off of other police forces for exactly the same kind of brutality. So one of the things that's happened to CBP over the last 15 years is that they've really lost any kind of genuine internal affairs functioning mechanism. There was an op-ed that was published, I think, just within the last 2 years about one of the individuals who worked in that shop, and he was bemoaning the fact that the changes there were really going to lead to problems, and he proved to be prophetic. So I think one of the first things that has to happen is you've got to have a reconstitution of that kind of internal affairs capability, CBP. But then you also have to have a Justice Department that's willing to go after agents that engage in violence, unwarranted use of force. And we just have not seen a proclivity on the part of folks to do that. And to get to Jeff's question, I'm going to give you all a message here, and I really hope you take it to heart. I spent 10 years as a lobbyist and 10 years on Capitol Hill. I'm going to tell you that none of these problems are going to get solved in any kind of substantive way unless you get involved in direct political action, and I'm talking about electoral action. That is what it's going to take. You want to get politicians interested in this, you need to make politicians afraid of you and not responding to your concerns. That's the key to all of this. I don't care if it's dealing with FISA surveillance, Rule 41, go down the list, this as well. You've got to be politically involved, and you've got to make your voices heard at the end of the day. Now, you know, I'm at Cato. We don't take pro-con positions on legislation, things of that nature. But what I can say to you, based on my experience from the Hill, is that politicians can be moved most effectively when they know that there are voters who are going to come after them if they do not do the right thing. And that's where you've got to start this entire process at the end of the day. Petitions are wonderful. They can help raise consciousness. But you have got to show politicians that if they allow these things to continue, there are going to be electoral consequences for them. End of soapbox.
You're welcome. This is the soapbox, so it's okay. Hassan.
Yeah, very quickly, at best case, U.S. Customs agents are a reflection of the general population. I say at best case because they're probably not. But the general population study has shown that 50% of Americans support the notion that American Muslims should have to wear special ID cards. Now, what was the last group that had to wear special ID cards? Was the Jews in Germany prior to the Holocaust. You have significant populations, depending on what demographic you're studying, that believe Islam should be illegal, sometimes over 60. About 70% of Trump voters supported the idea of banning Islam in America. Now, again, that's an assault on the Constitution, not on just not just on the Muslim community. So, unfortunately, a lot of the agents have this prejudice. And Gil Kurowski, the last CBP commissioner, admitted it. I mean, there needs to be much education regarding these issues because it is impacting how they interact. And they have a lot of power. I mean, recently, I forgot to mention this earlier, they're demanding social media passwords of American citizens. Imagine being forced to turn over your social media password. And the reason you're being forced to turn that over is because of your religion. So that's how problematic it is. And to address the other question very quickly, you know, there's a clear discriminatory agenda. Frontline recently did a documentary. I highly encourage you to watch the episode on Bannon's War. You know, he believes America should be at war with Islam, and now he's in the Oval Office, and then he pushed out the Muslim ban to further that. The Muslim ban did not happen, and this kind of targeting of Americans based on religion didn't happen in a vacuum. It's the result of the Islamophobia industry. You can go to Islamophobia.org and read about it, and read about the funding and how it impacts politics. But over $200 million being spent to demonize Americans based on their religion, demonize Islam, and really push for outlawing Islam. In Tennessee, they tried to pass a law saying practicing Islam is treason, punishable by 20 years in jail. And legislators were actually considering that kind of legislation. So it's no wonder that the CBP agent on the ground is picking on Americans based on their religion. And the real direct solution, by the way, besides the political work, is we have to educate the community. I mean, I'm telling the American Muslim community and everybody flat out, don't answer personal religious questions. The answer is, and I did this to an officer, he asked me a question and my answer was, none of your damn business. Okay, but they need to be put in place when they cross the constitutional boundaries, and we can't empower them to abuse it by giving in and answering their questions and turning over our social media passwords and so on.
We turn to close us out.
Can I add?
Professor.
Oh,
Professor.
Well, I don't know if we want to close out with this, but one thing I wanted to point out is that I think we should really pay attention. When we're thinking about training our agents, we should pay more attention to the Border Patrol Union and the ICE Union and the kind of power that they have to shape messages and policies. I've been looking at, in looking at overcrowding in the 80s and 90s, it's interesting how these policies of overcrowding, the intense overcrowding was impacting correctional officers. They were having to subdue people who were protesting unfair conditions. And so both inmates and correctional officers were affected by these policies, right? But correctional officers were able to shape the message that somehow we needed supermax prisons, we needed, more policing, we needed higher wages for them, and lobbying and gaining more power to shape these messages instead of pushing back and saying, you know what, these like mandatory minimums are messed up for all of us, inmates and correctional officers who frankly come from many low-income communities, right? And that's certainly the case with the Border Patrol. When I first started doing the research, I could tell the difference between agents who had grown up in border communities and agents who were kind of thrown in there and hired very quickly. And in my last visit, I noticed that the language was changing, that they didn't have that nuance in their language where they were talking about migrants as workers, as families, as people. In some cases, of course, there are some that haven't, but they were talking about them through a language of crime. They were saying, no, we're not calling them UDAs or undocumented aliens. They're illegal. I mean, that's a really different way of thinking and framing. So anyway, but the point I want to get out there is we should pay more attention to the Border Patrol Union and to the ICE Union and learn from what happened in the criminal justice system and the power that the Correctional Officers Union had.
Thank you so much. If you'll join me in thanking our panel. Thank you. Great. So I will introduce our final speaker before the lunch break. Last year, the Color of Surveillance Conference focused on surveillance of the African American community. And the image we designed for the conference featured leaders of the African American civil rights movement throughout the 20th century who'd been subject to legal or extra-legal surveillance. And included in that list from right to left were Martin Luther King, Whitney Young, Fannie Lou Hamer, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey, the leader of the Pan-Africanist movement and himself a Jamaican immigrant. And his persecution, Marcus Garvey's persecution, surveillance, and deportation are a testament to the fact that racial justice and immigrant rights are intertwined deeply. We are lucky to have with us today Nkechi Taifa from the Open Societies Foundations to speak about the deportation of Marcus Garvey. If you'll join me in welcoming Nkechi Taifa.
So the esteemed Professor Justin Hansford is one of the foremost scholars on Marcus Garvey, his movement, surveillance, deportation, and efforts at pardon. So I'm humbled to have been asked to sit in for him on this topic during his emergency away. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about Marcus Garvey, an individual I dare say many in this room have never heard about. Talk about why he was targeted, surveilled, imprisoned, and subsequently deported by the United States government and measures today to clear his name. So of all of the movements that began in the early part of the 20th century, it was the Garvey movement that was the most personal to me. Was it because it was the most successful mass organization during its time and probably afterwards for the pride and confidence and hope of the black community? Nope. Was it because the movement uplifted the critical importance of economic independence and the patronization of black businesses? Nope. Was it because the movement laid the seeds and served as the foundation for just about every black movement to come? No. The Garvey movement was most personal to me because it was in some way, shape, form, or fashion the movement that touched my grandfather, James Albert McIntosh, who was an immigrant from the islands, like Garvey, and he taught his son, my Uncle Ambrose, who was born in 1910, just to put it in chronological context, that was the same year that Harriet Tubman passed. He taught him about this man and his movement. Now, I never knew my grandfather because he passed when I was a baby, but I did know my Uncle Ambrose, who was a youth during the height of the Garvey movement during the early part of the 20th century. My uncle was not a militant, wasn't a race man, but like thousands of his contemporaries growing up in Harlem, New York, the Garvey movement was part of the ordinary course of affairs. You see, it was commonplace to see politicians and preachers and others honing their oratorical skills propped up on street corner soapboxes, and this is exactly what Marcus Garvey did. And my Uncle Ambrose, as a youth growing up amidst it all, being guided by his Caribbean-born father, he drank it all in. Marcus Garvey lives in history as one of the first leaders of the civil and human rights movement in the United States. He was born in Jamaica in 1887, witnessed firsthand the degradation of black people worldwide. He traveled to the United States after being profoundly influenced by Booker T. Washington's autobiography, and Garvey later announced, and I'm quoting, he said, "I read Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, and then my doom, if I so may call it, of being a race leader dawned upon me. I asked, where is the black man's government? Where is his king and his kingdom? Where is his president, his country, his ambassador, his army, his navy, his men of big affairs? And he said he looked around and he could not find them. And then he declared, I will help to make them. That was profound. And he was ultimately punished quite severely for it. In the early 20th century, Marcus Garvey was an advocate for the social, political, and economic independence for people of African descent around the world. And to unite his followers, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, also known as the UNIA, which at its height boasted nearly 6 million members spanning over 40 countries. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who laid a wreath at the Garvey Shrine in Jamaica, he stated, quote, Marcus Garvey was the first man on a mass scale and level to give millions of Negroes a sense of dignity and destiny and to make the Negro feel that he was somebody. And Malcolm X said that it was Marcus Garvey's philosophy of Pan-Africanism that initiated the entire freedom movement, which brought about the independence of African and Caribbean nations. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of an independent Ghana, stated, I think of all the literature I studied, the book that did more than any other to fire my enthusiasm was the philosophy and the opinions of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey's vision was not confined domestically. In 1920, he called for the first international convention of the UNIA with delegates representing all parts of the world. Several thousand black delegates came from the then all 48 states and from more than a score of countries spanning 3 continents. Among those in attendance were Ho Chi Minh, Kwame Nkrumah, Mahatma Gandhi, the Reverend Earl Little, Elijah Muhammad, all of whom would draw upon the teachings of Garvey at this convention in later years, fashioning struggles for victory around the world. Among those in the huge parades of Garvey during the early 20s were units of African Legionnaires, the military arm of Garvey's organization. And although unarmed, many of them had World War I experience, and their presence made it plain that they believed in self-defense. Another uniform part of the UNIA at the Harlem parades were the Black Cross nurses, and the existence of the Black Cross nurses indicated the readiness of the UNIA to come to the aid of stricken people all around the world. And although outsiders may have ridiculed the elaborate procedures of the Garvey organization, none overlooked its importance in restoring the all but shattered black self-confidence. During 1919 and 1920, the UNIA grew spectacularly and black masses responded by the thousands. Early in 1919, Garvey began to speak of a fleet of black-owned and operated steamships which would link all African people and unite the black diaspora. This fleet of ships was called the Black Star Line, whose purpose, he declared, was to serve as a commercial and spiritual tie among blacks wherever his ships traveled. So, what happened? Where are the Black Cross nurses today? Where are the original Black Legionnaires? Where is the Black Star Steamship Line? And just what happened to the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey? Despite its success as a symbol of black economic independence and a recruiting tool for the UNIA, the Black Star Line encountered significant obstacles due to racial issues. And moreover, although bustling at the end of World War I, the entire shipping industry faced a downturn in 1919. Shipping companies, including the Black Star Line, failed. During that time, the Black Star Line and its competitors continued to advertise shipping voyages until the day the company ceased to do business. However, it was only Marcus Garvey who was the one charged with engaging in misrepresentation and trying to keep his operation afloat during the industry's depression. There was also opposition from Garvey's rivals in the black community. Garvey had an extensive grassroots network and was raking in loads of money and essentially cornered the personal contribution market. His rivals engaged in a vicious campaign to manipulate the public narrative about Garvey, and this smear campaign was coordinated in concert with the United States government. Permit me to share with you an example of one of the many reports received by the Military Intelligence Division of the United States Army. Quote, there is a man by the name of Garvey, in parentheses, colored, who preaches every night against the white people, generally from 134th to 137th Street and Lenox Avenue. Another example, on September 18, 1918, the Bureau of Investigation reported that, quote, a confidential employee, end of quote, had been inserted in Garvey's meetings who submitted reports and copies of the Negro World, that was the publication that Garvey started, with a warning that Garvey's activities must be closely watched. In 1919, J. Edgar Hoover was placed as head of the General Intelligence Division of the DOJ's Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, responsible for gathering evidence against radicals and immigrants the government feared were promoting communism. And in 1919, J. Edgar Hoover wrote a memo that Garvey, quote, was particularly active among the radical elements in New York City in agitating the Negro movement. Unfortunately, however, Hoover continued, quote, he has not violated any federal law whereby he could be proceeded against on the grounds of being an undesirable alien from the point of view of deportation. It occurs to me, however, Hoover continued, from the attached clippings that there might be some proceeding against him for fraud in connection with the Black Star Line propaganda. It is clear that for years before Garvey's eventual arrest for mail fraud in connection with the Black Star Line, Hoover pursued and targeted Garvey, and by early 1990, multiple federal agents had infiltrated his organization or befriended him. Sound familiar? Garvey was viewed as a threat. And decades before Dr. King would be targeted for his activism, J. Edgar Hoover led the Bureau of Investigation in its surveillance of Mr. Garvey and actively sought measures to disrupt and destroy the Garvey movement. Garvey became the first official target of what later became known as COINTELPRO, the FBI's once secret and quite illegal counterintelligence campaign to disrupt and destroy movements in general and the Black nationalist movement specifically. Never meant to be revealed to the world, these millions of pages of documents reveal what the Church Senate Select Committee, which later investigated the COINTELPRO, characterized as an orchestrated, coordinated war by the government against constitutionally protected activities. In 1923, based on intelligence gathered from undercover agents posing as Garvey supporters and aided by judicial proceedings that have largely been condemned as factually unsound and politically and racially motivated, Marcus Garvey was convicted of mail fraud and sentenced to the maximum 5 years in federal prison. As early as 1927, the U.S. Attorney General concluded that the case against him was unwarranted and untenable, given the weak evidence against him. And in partial recognition of these facts, President Calvin Coolidge commuted his sentence in November of 1927, and he was promptly deported to Jamaica. A congressional inquiry and review of the historical record has led to agreement that Garvey was wrongfully convicted of using the mails to further a scheme to defraud. That conviction led to Garvey's deportation, effectively ended the movement which he spawned, precipitated his personal demise, and has harmed his family and community for over 90 years. So what caused the destabilization of Garvey's movement? The same thing that characterized movements before Garvey and after Garvey. The FBI memo stated that the goal of the COINTELPRO was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalist organizations and groupings and their leadership, their spokesmen, their membership, and their supporters. And in their own words, the FBI memo expanding the program described the long-range goals of the COINTELPRO as, number one, to prevent the coalition of Black nationalist militant groups. Number two, to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. To prevent Black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability. And a final goal of the FBI stated was to prevent the long-range growth of militant Black organizations, especially among the youth. And it goes on and on. You've seen it. I'm coming to a close. The Black community is still recovering from that unfortunate and highly successful enterprise. And there are still people languishing in prison who are victims of the COINTELPRO of the 60s and 70s. Although Garvey's sentence was commuted, his name is still tarnished by the stigma of his conviction. The Garvey family seeks to amend the historical record to reflect the esteemed nature of their ancestors' contributions to the global community. On June 27, 2016, an application for a posthumous pardon for Marcus Garvey was filed with the Office of the Pardon Attorney by his youngest son, Dr. Julius Garvey, on behalf of the Garvey descendants, Professor Charles Ogletree, Professor Justin Hansford, and Aiken Gump, law firm, and I was honored to serve as part of the legal advisory team. Presidential posthumous pardons have been granted to correct injustices and heal societal divisions by restoring the unjustifiably diminished reputations of historical figures admired by their communities. Marcus Garvey was targeted because of his race, because of his political beliefs. He received an unfair trial, and he was unceremoniously deported. And efforts to fully clear his name have been ongoing and concerted on the part of the U.S. Congress, civil society organizations, cities, states, and international groups. The government of Jamaica declared Garvey its first national hero, bestowed the title of the Right Excellent to his name, and placed his image on Jamaican currency. The red, black, and green flag of the Garvey movement has become known as the flag of the Pan-African movement worldwide. So more than 90 years after the imposition of his unjust sentence, it is time to exonerate Marcus Garvey and let history reflect the true nature of his legacy. Thank you, Georgetown Center for Privacy and Technology, for including this important bit of history as part of this prestigious conference. Thank you.
Our center would so love to feed all of you, but unfortunately we're not that wealthy. And so there is information outside on, first of all, we have a cafeteria, which is basically if you go up the stairs and head that way, you will bump into. We also have information on places where you can get lunch around town. If you are a speaker, a member of the Color of Surveillance delegation, or one of the guests that we've previously spoken to, please do join us for lunch in McDonough 425. That is directly upstairs. And Megan, if you could stand up, Megan will show you the way, and also perhaps Allie might be able to show them the way. Wonderful. So Megan and Allie will show you, our speakers and delegation the way to McDonough 425. The rest of you, we will be back at 1 p.m. sharp for our keynote remarks from Vinita Gupta, Chairman and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Please do not be late. It should not be missed. Thank you.